For 9 winters in a row, Walter Brennan fixed a stranger's old truck for free and never once mentioned it to another living soul outside his own garage. He didn't know the man's last name for the first 4 of those years. He didn't know what the man did for a living, or where he went when he drove north out of Coldwater Ridge every spring, or why a truck that expensive-looking underneath the rust could possibly belong to somebody who paid in crumpled 20s and sometimes couldn't pay at all. All Walter knew was that every December, like clockwork, a dark blue Ford pickup with a failing heater core or a cracked manifold or brake lines rotted through by road salt would rattle into his gravel lot on Route 4, and an older man in a canvas barn coat would climb out, apologize for the trouble, and ask if there was any way Walter could look at it before the real cold set in. And every single time, without fail, Walter Brennan would say the same thing he'd said the first time. "Pull it into the bay, Everett. We'll get you sorted. 9 years, 9 winters." He never sent a real bill. He never asked where the money came from on the rare occasions there was any. He had absolutely no idea that the man standing in his cold garage in a coat with a torn pocket owned 2 sawmills, a granite quarry, 4 apartment buildings, 4,000 acres of timberland, and roughly half of every deed recorded in Ashcombe County, New Hampshire. Walter thought he was helping out a broke old retiree who couldn't afford a mechanic. He had no idea he was the only man in 3 counties who had ever fixed that truck without trying to find out, first, whether fixing it would pay. My name doesn't matter as much as Walter's does in this story, but I'll tell it anyway, because somebody has to be the one telling it. And it might as well be somebody who watched most of it happen from a folding chair by the wood stove in the corner of that garage. This is the story of Walter Brennan, 46 years old, owner of Brennan's Auto and Diesel on Route 4 outside Coldwater Ridge, New Hampshire. And it is the story of what happened the winter he finally found out who Everett Holloway really was, and what that man did afterward, and the strange, frightening, ultimately redeeming 6 months that followed, when the truth about 9 years of quiet kindness nearly tore apart 2 families before it saved both of them. I want to tell it slowly, the way Walter would tell it if he weren't the kind of man who'd rather talk about torque specs than his own feelings. Because I think the only way this story makes any sense at all is if you understand exactly who Walter was before any of this started, and exactly what Coldwater Ridge was, and exactly how ordinary that first snowy Tuesday truly felt at the time. Coldwater Ridge sits about 40 minutes north of Concord if the roads are clear, considerably longer if they're not, which in a New Hampshire winter is more often than the town's tourism board would like to advertise. It's the kind of town that used to have a working paper mill and a train depot, and doesn't have either anymore. Just a main street with a hardware store, a diner called the Ridge Line, a congregational church with a steeple that leans very slightly to the east in a way nobody's gotten around to fixing, and Brennan's Auto and Diesel, which sits on Route 4 about a mile out of the actual downtown, in a low cinder block building with 2 bays and a gravel lot that turns to a genuine swamp every April. Walter's father, Del Brennan, built that garage with his own hands in 1974, back when the mill was still running 3 shifts and half the trucks in the county needed servicing every few months, just from hauling logs on roads that ate transmissions for breakfast. Walter grew up underneath cars the way other kids grew up on baseball fields. By the time he was 12, he could change a clutch. By the time he was 20, he was running half the shop himself, while Del's knees gave out on him 1 joint at a time. Del passed in a February 11 years ago now. Heart attack in the middle of a snowstorm of all things, still holding a torque wrench when Walter found him, which is a detail Walter has never once told anybody except his wife, and which I only know because Nadine told me years later when she was trying to explain why Walter does what he does the way he does it. Walter married Nadine Cole the summer he turned 24, a wedding in the back field behind her parents' place with maybe 60 folding chairs and a tent that leaked a little when it rained around 6 in the evening, which it did and which nobody minded even a little. Nadine teaches third grade at Coldwater Ridge Elementary, has for 18 years now, and if you want to understand the particular flavor of decency that runs through this whole family, you only need to know that she has, on multiple occasions, bought winter boots out of her own paycheck for kids in her class whose families were between things, and never told the school, and never told anyone except Walter, who found out by accident when he saw the receipt. They have one son, Sam, 22 now, who came up through that same garage the way Walter did through his father's, elbow deep in transmission fluid since he was old enough to hold a socket wrench without dropping it, and who works the second bay full-time now and who has, in the last year or so, started quietly taking over more of the business side, the invoicing, the parts ordering, the stuff Walter has always found more exhausting than any engine rebuild. They live in a modest ranch house about 2 miles from the garage that Walter and his father built additions onto twice. They drive a 10-year-old truck that Walter maintains with an almost religious devotion, and they are not rich people. I want to be very clear about that from the beginning, because everything that follows only makes sense if you understand there was never a version of this story where Walter had money sitting around to give away. Every single time Walter Brennan chose to help Everett Holloway for free, it was a real choice, made against a real cost, by a man who was doing the math on his own family's winter every single time he made it. The garage itself runs on a margin thinner than most people would guess looking at a full parking lot. Route 4 doesn't carry the traffic it used to since the new highway bypass went in 14 years back, siphoning off the long-haul trucking business that used to be Brennan's bread and butter. What's left is mostly local, oil changes and brake jobs, and the occasional blown head gasket, plus a loyal handful of logging outfits and dairy farmers who've used Brennan's for 3 generations and wouldn't dream of taking their equipment anywhere else. It's enough to keep the lights on, mostly, and enough to keep Walter and Sam and their one other full-time mechanic, a quiet, enormous man named Gus Petrakis, who's worked there since before Sam was born, employed and paid. But it is not the kind of business that generates slack. There is no slush fund at Brennan's Auto and Diesel. There is no line item for charity work. Every free repair Walter Brennan ever did for Everett Holloway came directly and specifically out of Walter's own pocket, in the form of parts paid for and labor hours not billed, money that, in a leaner year, might have been the difference between a comfortable Christmas and a tight one. The first time Everett Holloway's truck rattled into that gravel lot was 9 years ago this past December, a Tuesday, the kind of gray afternoon where the sky seems to sit right on top of the tree line and the first real snow of the season is already starting to come down sideways. Walter remembers it specifically because he and Sam, only 13 at the time, were both under a dairy farmer's flatbed trying to chase down an exhaust leak, and the bell over the office door hadn't rung so much as the whole building had seemed to shudder slightly as an old dark blue Ford F-150 limped in on what was very obviously 3 good cylinders and one that had given up entirely. An older man climbed out, somewhere in his 60s, tall, silver-haired, wearing a canvas barn coat that had clearly been through a great many winters, and stood by the truck for a moment with the particular stillness of a man deciding how to ask for something he wasn't sure he could pay for. Walter came out wiping his hands on a shop rag, and the man said, apologetically, in a voice that was calm and unhurried in a way that struck Walter as slightly odd for someone whose truck was clearly dying in real time, "I'm sorry to just show up like this. She's been running rough for about a week, and I think she finally quit on me for good just now, about a half-mile back. I had to coast the last stretch. My name's Everett Holloway." And Walter, who has never in his life turned away a broken-down vehicle in the snow, said what he always says, which is, "Well, let's get her inside where it's warm and take a look," and pushed the truck the last 20 feet into the near bay himself while Everett steered. It took Walter about 4 minutes under the hood to understand the truck was in considerably worse shape than a single dead cylinder. The plugs were fouled, the fuel filter looked like it hadn't been changed in years. There was a coolant leak he could smell before he could see it. And the whole undercarriage had the kind of road salt rot that told him this truck had spent a great many winters exactly like this one, on roads exactly like these. It was, by Walter's later estimate, a truck worth perhaps $800 on a good day to the right buyer, and the repairs it needed that afternoon alone would run close to $400 if you did everything by the book. Walter laid it out for Everett plainly, the way he lays everything out for every customer. No dressing it up. Here's what's wrong. Here's what it'll cost. Here's what I genuinely recommend versus what you can get away with for now. And Everett Holloway stood there in his coat, looking at the truck with an expression Walter couldn't quite place, something between fondness and fatigue, and said quietly, "I appreciate you being straight with me. Can you tell me honestly what the bare minimum is? Just to get her running well enough to get me home and back a few more times this winter. I'm not in a position to do the whole job today." And Walter, who had grown up watching his own father extend credit to half the loggers in the county through lean months without ever once making a show of it, looked at this older man standing in the cold in a coat with a frayed cuff, and made a decision in about the time it takes to exhale. He said, "Tell you what, let me do the plugs in the filter and get that coolant leak stopped today, and we'll call it even for now, and you come back when the roads get better, and we'll sort out the rest properly." Everett's face did something complicated at that, a kind of surprise that seemed larger than the moment warranted, and he said, "I couldn't ask you to do that." And Walter said, "You didn't ask," I offered, which is a distinction Walter has made to me more than once over the years and clearly considers important. Everett tried to press two $20 bills into Walter's hand before he left, which was, Walter later worked out, probably close to everything the man was carrying that day. And Walter took it, because he could see refusing it entirely would have cost the man something he needed to keep, some thread of dignity in the transaction. But he undercharged so dramatically that the parts alone had cost him more than what he accepted. Everett Holloway drove that truck out of the lot 40 minutes later, running smoother than it had in months, and Walter genuinely thought that was the end of it. One broke old man, one act of ordinary kindness, the kind of thing that happens in small towns and gets forgotten by dinner. He came back the following December. Same truck, new problems, a alternator this time, belts worn thin, a heater blower motor rattling like a coffee can full of gravel. And Walter did the same thing, because by then, without ever really deciding to, some quiet internal accounting had already settled into place. He looked at the man's coat, still the same one, a little more worn. He looked at the same careful, dignified way Everett tried and failed to pay what the work was actually worth, and he thought, essentially, this is a man who needs his truck running through a New Hampshire winter and doesn't have much to make that happen with, and I am, in fact, in a position to be the reason that happens for him, so I will be. Nadine asked him about it that second winter, when Walter mentioned, almost as an afterthought over dinner, that the fellow with the old Ford had come back, and Walter told her honestly he'd done the work near enough to free again, and Nadine, who has never once in 18 years of marriage told Walter he was being foolish with the shop's money, even when she probably should have, just nodded and said, "Well, somebody ought to look after that truck if he can't," and passed him the potatoes. And that was, more or less, the full extent of the conversation about it in their house for the next several years. Gus Petrakis noticed before anyone else, because Gus notices everything about that garage, having spent more of his waking life inside it than in his own house, by his own cheerful admission. Somewhere around the third winter, watching Walter wave off payment yet again on a brake job for the man in the blue Ford, Gus set down his own wrench, wiped his hands, and said, in the flat, unbothered way Gus says everything, "Walt, you know that fella never pays full price, right?" And Walter said, "I know, Gus." And Gus said, "And you're going to keep doing the same thing every winter regardless." And Walter said, probably, "Yeah," and Gus, who has exactly the kind of loyalty that doesn't require an explanation to keep functioning, shrugged and said, "All right then," and went back to his own work and never brought it up again, except once a year or so, mostly to ask, with something between amusement and genuine fondness, whether Everett's truck had shown up yet that winter, the way you'd ask about a migrating bird you'd come to look forward to. Sam grew up watching it happen, which matters more to this story than it might seem to at first, because Sam was 13 the first winter and 22 by the ninth. And somewhere in those 9 years, he went from a kid who didn't think much about it at all to a young man who'd quietly absorbed an entire philosophy of how his father ran a business without either of them ever sitting down and calling it a lesson. Sam has told me since that he used to do rough math in his head some winters, the cost of parts against what his father accepted, and it used to bother him a little. In the practical, business-like way a young man starting to understand margins gets bothered by anything that looks like money walking out the door for nothing. He asked his father once, maybe 4 years into it, straight out, "Why do you keep doing his truck for free, Dad? We're not exactly swimming in cash ourselves." And Walter, who doesn't often explain himself at length, thought about it for a minute and said, "You remember your grandfather?" And Sam said, "Some." And Walter said, "Your grandfather used to say the shop owes the town more than the town owes the shop, on account of the town's the reason there was ever a shop to begin with. And every year, I don't have to worry about whether we're going to make rent is a year. I get to decide what kind of shop this actually is, instead of letting the bank decide it for me. That's about the whole of it, Sam. We're not hurting. He is. That's the math. Best I can tell it." Sam didn't have a comeback for that, and it's a conversation he's brought up to me more than once since everything came out, usually adding that it's the closest his father has ever come to giving him what Sam calls one of his speeches, which in the Brennan family apparently counts as a rare and notable event. Everett Holloway, over those 9 years, became as much a fixture of Brennan's auto and diesel as the wood stove in the corner or the ancient calendar from the parts distributor that nobody ever bothered updating past a certain year. He came in December, without fail, sometimes with a specific problem already announced, and sometimes just saying, "She's been running a little off, Walter. See what you make of it." And he'd sit in the one good chair by the stove while Walter or Sam or Gus worked. Drinking coffee from a thermos he brought himself rather than the shop's questionable pot, and he'd talk in the unhurried way of a man with more time than urgent company. He asked after Nadine's classroom every year, remembered specific kids by name from one winter to the next in a way that struck Walter as slightly uncanny for a man who'd supposedly never met any of them. He asked after Sam's progress in the shop with what seemed like genuine, informed interest, once correcting Sam gently but accurately on a torque. Spec Sam had misremembered, which Sam found almost eerie at the time and considerably more explicable later. He never talked much about himself. He mentioned over the years, in the same flat, unemotional way you'd mention weather, that his wife had passed some years back, no name given, no year specified, and that he did some work that kept him away from the area for stretches at a time, which Walter always took to mean seasonal labor of some kind, maybe logging work up in Maine or construction downstate, the ordinary explanation available to an ordinary man of modest means. Walter never pressed. That is simply not the kind of question Walter Brennan asks a man who's clearly having a hard enough time as it is. The winters accumulated the way winters do in a place like Coldwater Ridge, blurring together into one long, cold season, interrupted by a handful of specific, memorable storms. Sam finished high school and went 2 towns over for a 2-year automotive technology program before coming back to the shop full-time, which Walter has never said out loud but is plainly one of the proudest facts of his adult life. Dell's old cinder-block building got a new roof 5 years back. Financed through a loan Walter is still paying off in careful monthly installments. Nadine's classroom got smaller 3 years ago when the district consolidated 2 elementary schools into one, a decision that still makes her quietly furious if you bring it up at the wrong moment. And every December, like a tide coming in on schedule, the blue Ford would rattle into the lot, a little more rust each year, a little more patched with the specific kind of makeshift repairs a man does himself between visits, and Everett Holloway would climb out in that same canvas coat, apologize for the trouble, and Walter would say, "Pull her in, Everett, let's get you sorted," the way you'd greet a returning bird or the first frost or any other fixture of a season you've come, without quite realizing it, to depend on. I want to tell you about the worst winter because it matters enormously to everything that came after, and because I think it's the truest measure of who Walter Brennan actually is, underneath all the easy kindness of the good years. This was the sixth winter, and it was, by a wide margin, the hardest one Brennan's auto and diesel had weathered in Walter's time running it. The bypass had just siphoned off a logging contract that had been steady income for over a decade. The new roof loan was eating a chunk of the monthly margin, and a hard January freeze had cracked the block on the shop's own tow truck. An $11,000 repair Walter did not have $11,000 sitting anywhere to cover. Nadine had picked up grading extra assignments for a stipend that barely covered groceries. Sam was still in his automotive program 2 towns over, and while his tuition was mostly handled by scholarship, there were fees and books and a second-hand car of his own that kept needing attention. For about 6 weeks that winter, Walter did the specific, quiet arithmetic of a small business owner, trying to figure out which bill could wait another 2 weeks and which one absolutely could not. And I know this because Nadine told me, years later, that it was the only stretch of their marriage where she ever saw Walter genuinely frightened about money, not stressed, not frustrated, actually frightened. In the particular way a man gets when the thing he's frightened for isn't himself, but the people depending on him. And it was into exactly that 6-week stretch that Everett Holloway's truck rattled into the lot, needing, of all things, a full brake job, rotors and pads, and a caliper that had seized entirely. Close to $500 in parts and labor if billed properly. Walter told me himself years later, sitting by that same wood stove, that there was a moment, a real moment, standing in the cold with his own tow truck sitting dead in the second bay and his own family's numbers not working, where some small tired part of him looked at Everett's truck up on the lift and thought, not this year, I can't do this one for free this year, I need to actually charge him something close to what it costs. And then Everett had come in from the cold rubbing his hands together, that same coat, a little thinner at the elbows than the year before, and asked, with his usual quiet apology, already halfway prepared on his face, "How bad is it this time, Walter?" And Walter looked at him and thought about his own father, who had kept extending the same kind of grace to the same kind of struggling families through his own leanest years, and thought, if I start deciding who deserves it based on how bad my own week is, I've stopped actually doing it at all. I've just started performing it when it's convenient. And that's not what my father built this place to be. So Walter did the brake job and charged Everett $60, which didn't come close to covering the parts, let alone the labor, and ate the rest of it himself, out of a bank account that could not comfortably afford to eat much of anything that particular February. And told nobody except Nadine, who found out only because she does the shop's books on Sunday afternoons and noticed the number. She didn't say a word of complaint about it, not one, though Walter has told me since that he watched her face carefully when she found the entry, half expecting, for the first time in 18 years, some flicker of, "Are you serious right now?" And instead, she just looked up at him and said, "That man's luckier than he probably knows, having you for a mechanic," and went back to the books. And Walter has told me that single sentence did more to keep him steady through the rest of that hard winter than almost anything else that happened in it. The tow truck got fixed eventually, on a payment plan with the parts distributor that took the better part of a year to clear. The bills got paid, a little late in places, but paid. And Everett Holloway's truck ran clean and quiet through the rest of that particular winter, its owner never once knowing how close the man fixing it had come, that year specifically, to not being able to afford the kindness he gave without a second thought anyway. I should tell you about Marsh Petrakis' transmission, because it's a small story inside the bigger one, and I think it explains Coldwater Ridge in a way no amount of describing the town in the abstract ever could. This was around the 7th winter, and it has nothing directly to do with Everett Holloway at all, except that it happened in the same garage, among the same people, and I think it's the reason Everett kept coming back to that specific shop for 9 years, instead of any of the others he could theoretically have chosen in his travels. Gus Petrakis' own brother Marsh, who farms about 600 acres of dairy land 20 minutes north, blew a transmission on his one working hay truck in the exact middle of a July cutting, the worst possible week of the year for a dairy operation to lose its hauling capacity. Walter and Sam and Gus spent 2 consecutive nights off the clock pulling that transmission and rebuilding it with parts sourced from 3 different suppliers because none of them had the full inventory in stock, and when Marsh tried to pay full shop rate for 2 mechanics' overnight labor, Walter quietly billed him for 1 afternoon of standard work and refused to discuss it further. Gus told me once, without any prompting at all, that this is simply what the shop is. Underneath the invoices and the posted rates, a place that shows up for its own first and figures out the bookkeeping second. And that Everett, whatever else was going on with him, had clearly noticed that pattern held steady no matter who walked through the door, which I think is exactly right, and which matters enormously to what Everett told us later about why Coldwater Ridge specifically had earned 9 years of his quiet, careful attention. The 8th winter brought the first real crack in the ordinary shape of things, though none of us understood at the time what we were actually looking at. Everett arrived in December as always, but noticeably thinner, moving slower getting out of the truck, and when Walter asked in his usual understated way whether everything was all right, Everett said only that he'd had a difficult year, health-wise, nothing serious, just the ordinary erosions of getting older, and changed the subject toward the truck's ailing water pump with the practiced ease of a man who has spent a great many years redirecting conversations away from himself. He mentioned that winter, almost in passing, that he had 2 grown children, a son and a daughter. The first time in 8 years he'd volunteered that detail unprompted, and when Walter asked, mildly, whether they lived close by, Everett's face did something complicated, something Walter described to Nadine that night as looking like a man chewing on a piece of gristle he couldn't quite get down, and he said, "Not as close as I'd like these days," and left it there. Walter didn't press. It is, again, simply not the kind of question Walter Brennan asks, but he mentioned it to Nadine, and Nadine, who notices things Walter sometimes doesn't, said, "That man's carrying something heavier than a bad water pump this year, Walt." And Walter agreed, and neither of them had any idea that December, exactly how right she was, or how soon they were going to find out the actual size and shape of what Everett Holloway had been carrying. The 9th winter began the way all the others had, which is precisely what made everything that followed so disorienting when it finally arrived. It was the first week of December, a hard cold snap settling in early that year, and the blue Ford, now 16 years old by Walter's count, and held together by roughly as much of Walter's own labor as original factory parts, rattled into the lot around 3 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, exhaust ticking, one headlight dimmer than the other. Everett climbed out slower than ever, and Walter, wiping his hands on a shop rag the way he always did, came out to meet him and said what he always said. "Let's get her inside, Everett. See what we're dealing with." What they were dealing with, it turned out over the next hour, was considerably more than a headlight. The truck's frame had finally begun to go, rust having worked all the way through in 2 places along the rear frame rail, the kind of structural failure that isn't a repair anymore so much as a verdict. Walter got it up on the lift, and Sam, 22 now and running his own diagnostics alongside his father without needing to be told anymore, took one look at the underside and said quietly, so only Walter could hear it, "Dad, this truck's done. There's no fixing this. Not safely. Not for what it had cost." And Walter climbed down off the creeper and looked at Everett Holloway standing by the wood stove with his hands wrapped around his thermos, an old man in a coat that had, over 9 winters, gone from merely worn to genuinely threadbare, and had to have, for the first time in 9 years, a conversation neither of them had ever needed to have before. He told Everett straight, because that is the only way Walter Brennan has ever told anyone anything. "Everett, I've got bad news. Frame's rusted through in 2 spots, right where it'd matter most if you hit anything harder than a pothole at speed. I could patch it, but I wouldn't put my own family in that truck after I did, and I'm not going to tell you it's safe when it isn't. This truck's done, far as safe daily driving goes." And Everett Holloway, for the first time in 9 years, did not immediately start patting his coat pockets in that small apologetic way of his. He simply stood very still for a moment, looking at the truck up on the lift, and then he looked at Walter, and something in his face had changed, some final door quietly deciding to open after 9 years of staying shut. And he said, in a voice Walter had never once heard him use, steady, clear, entirely without the frailness that had colored every single conversation between them for nearly a decade. "Walter, I think it's time I told you something, and I think you'd better sit down first, because I suspect somewhere around minute 3 of this, you're going to want to be sitting down." Walter told me later that his first thought, hearing that shift in Everett's voice, was that the man was dying, that this was some kind of goodbye speech dressed up in a change of tone, and he felt a genuine stab of grief at the thought before Everett had said another word, which tells you something important about how much this supposedly broke old stranger had actually come to matter to him over 9 winters of December. Brake jobs and thermos coffee by the stove. Sam had gone quiet in the corner, sensing something in the air the way young men sometimes do before they can name it. Gus had stopped his own work entirely and was standing with a socket wrench still in his hand, watching. Walter pulled the second folding chair over next to Everett's and sat and said, "All right, Everett, I'm sitting." And Everett Holloway reached into that same threadbare canvas coat, the one Walter had watched fray and thin across 9 winters, and took out a phone that was, Walter noticed immediately, entirely wrong for the rest of him, brand new, expensive. The kind of phone that didn't belong to a man who couldn't afford a truck frame repair, and he tapped it a few times and turned the screen around. It was a news article, the kind with a stock corporate photograph at the top, a much younger, cleaner version of the man sitting 3 feet away, silver hair combed instead of wind-tossed, wearing a charcoal suit instead of a canvas coat, standing in front of a wall of windows with granite hills visible behind him. The headline read something to the effect of Everett Holloway, founder and chairman of Holloway County Holdings, discusses 4 decades of building New Hampshire's largest privately held timber and quarry enterprise. Walter read it twice, the way you read something that isn't computing the first time, and looked up at Everett and looked back down at the phone and said, out loud, without quite meaning to, "This doesn't make any sense." And Everett Holloway, watching his face carefully the way you watch someone absorb a piece of information you've been waiting 9 years to hand them, said quietly, "It does, Walter. It makes a tremendous amount of sense. It just doesn't make the kind of sense you're used to yet." He told the story slowly over the next half hour, while Sam quietly locked the front office door so no other customer would wander into the middle of it, and Gus put on a second pot of coffee without being asked, and Walter sat in that folding chair with his hands still faintly smelling of brake fluid, listening to a man he'd known for 9 years explain who he actually was. Everett Holloway had built Holloway County Holdings up from a single sawmill his own father had started outside Ashcombe in the 1960s, grown it over 4 decades into 2 sawmills, a granite quarry, 4 apartment buildings in 3 different towns, and roughly 4,000 acres of timberland. An enterprise valued, the last time anyone outside his own accountants had cause to estimate it publicly, somewhere north of $300 million. He was not, he said, ashamed of any of that, had built it honestly, employed generations of families across Ashcombe County who'd otherwise have had to leave for work the way so many young people from towns like Coldwater Ridge eventually did. But he told Walter that somewhere in the last decade of building it, particularly after his wife Marion died, 9 years ago almost to the month, he had lost something he hadn't fully understood he was losing until it was mostly gone, which was the ability to trust that anyone being kind to him meant it plainly without an angle. He said, and this part he said looking down at his own folded hands rather than at Walter, "When you're the man who signs 400 paychecks and sits on the board of 3 regional banks, Walter, everyone who's nice to you has a reason, and after enough years of that, you stop being able to tell the difference between a kindness and a transaction dressed up to look like one. And eventually, if you're not careful, you forget how to be kind yourself without calculating an angle of your own first." Marion had been the last person who still treated him like Everett instead of like Holloway County Holdings. And when she was gone, he found himself surrounded by a board and a staff and a great many people whose warmth toward him he could no longer separate from their salaries or their stock options. and he had made, somewhat impulsively, against the explicit advice of his own company lawyers, a decision his own children privately considered evidence of a grieving man coming unmoored. He decided a little over 9 years ago now to disappear periodically and deliberately into small towns in an old truck and an old coat, carrying just enough cash to look convincingly modest, and see, stripped of the name and the title and the money, who would still treat him decently when he had, as far as they could tell, nothing at all to offer back. Coldwater Ridge, he told Walter plainly, had not been an accident. Not entirely. Holloway County Holdings had, for some years before that first December, been quietly weighing an expansion of its milling operations somewhere in the northern part of the state, a project that would eventually mean, depending on scale, somewhere between 100 and 200 new jobs in a region that badly needed them, the kind of investment that could meaningfully change the fortunes of a shrinking town like Coldwater Ridge for a generation. There had been 3 towns on his own private shortlist, towns his executives had already run the financial numbers on independently, and Everett had visited all 3 personally, incognito, over about 2 years, not as the chairman doing a formal site tour with consultants trailing behind him, but as a broke old stranger with a dying truck, testing something no spreadsheet could ever measure, which was what kind of place this actually was to the people who might end up working there, underneath the tax incentives and the zoning paperwork. In one of the other towns, he said plainly, without editorializing, a garage owner had not only refused to help without full payment up front, but had actually threatened to call the police over an unpaid invoice for a simple oil change, treating him with a suspicion that told Everett everything he needed to know about that town's temperature toward anyone who looked poor. In the second town, people had been perfectly polite and utterly indifferent, the specific kind of looking through you that a man learns to recognize once he's experienced its opposite. And in Coldwater Ridge, at Brennan's Auto and Diesel on Route 4, a mechanic with a struggling shop of his own had, on a gray Tuesday 9 years ago, and roughly 40 times since, fixed his truck for next to nothing and never once, not one single time in 9 years, made him feel smaller for needing it. I sat there, or rather, Walter sat there, 46 years old, a mechanic with a mortgage on his roof and a payment plan still trailing off from a tow truck repair 3 years back, and listened to a $300 million man tell him that he had, without ever knowing it, been the deciding factor in where a company was about to build a facility that would employ up to 200 people in the county where Walter had lived his entire life. And Walter has told me since that what he felt in that moment was not triumph or vindication. It was something closer to a strange, quiet grief for every single one of those 9 winters where he'd stood in that garage doing math against his own family's needs, never once knowing that the answer to his private, tired question of can we afford this again this year had been, this entire time, tangled up with the future of half the county around him. There was one more thing Walter needed to ask, and it had been sitting under his ribs since the moment he'd realized who was actually sitting across from him. So he asked it plainly, the way he asks everything. Everett, why us? Why this shop specifically? All 9 years, when a man in your position could have had somebody drive that truck to Boston and have it looked at by whoever he wanted. And Everett Holloway went quiet for a moment, turning his coffee thermos slowly in his hands, and said, "Do you want to know why I kept bringing that particular truck to you, Walter, instead of simply buying myself something new and reliable?" Which, believe me, my accountant suggested more than once. And Walter said, "Yeah, actually, I do." And Everett said, "That truck was the last thing Marion and I bought together before she got sick. A stupid practical decision. We needed something to haul firewood in, and she picked the color. Believe it or not, dark blue, because she said anything lighter would show the mud too much. And she was right. She usually was. In the last good year we had before her diagnosis, she used to ride out with me most Saturdays just to get out of the house. And I have never once been able to make myself get rid of that truck. And I have never once been able to make myself pay someone to just fix it and forget it. Because the fixing of it, the actual coming back every winter and sitting by somebody's stove while it got looked after properly, That became the only appointment on my whole calendar that had nothing to do with Holloway County Holdings in it. Everyone else in my life wants something from Everett Holloway, the chairman. Here, for one afternoon a year, I got to just be a man whose truck needed work, sitting by a stove, talking about a kid's transmission program or a teacher's classroom. And Walter, I want you to understand, that was never really about the truck. The truck was just the reason I got to keep coming back. Walter sat with that for a long moment, because it reframed 9 years of December visits into something considerably more tender than he'd understood them to be at the time. And he found himself thinking of his own father, gone 11 years now, and how Del Brennan used to say that half of running a garage was actually just running a place people felt like they could sit down in. And Walter said quietly, "Well, Everett, for what it's worth, you were never just a truck to me either. You're the fella who remembered my kid's torque spec better than my kid did." Everett laughed at that, a real laugh. The first genuinely unguarded sound Walter had heard out of him in 9 years. And something in the room loosened after that. The particular tension of a secret finally let out, settling into something more like relief. Gus, who had been standing quietly through most of this, with a socket wrench still forgotten in one enormous hand, finally spoke up in his characteristically flat, unbothered way and said, "So are we still doing the frame repair or what? Because if this fella's got $300 million, he can afford a new truck." And Everett laughed again, harder this time, and said, "Gus, I believe that may be the single most reasonable response anyone's had to this conversation yet. And yes, I think it's finally time to retire her." And Sam, standing by the office door, said quietly, almost to himself, "This is the strangest afternoon of my entire life," which turned out to be a sentiment shared in one form or another by every single person in that garage. Everett told Walter then what he wanted to do, and it was considerably more than Walter felt even remotely prepared to hear, let alone accept. Holloway County Holdings was, in fact, going forward with the milling expansion in Coldwater Ridge specifically, a decision, he was careful to explain, that had been made independently on its own financial merits some months earlier, and did not hinge in any way on anything Everett was about to offer Walter personally, because he wanted Walter to never carry around any confusion about whether his own kindness had somehow purchased the town's future, or simply happened to align with a decision that stood soundly on its own. Walter appreciated that distinction more than he could easily put into words, because some careful part of him had already begun worrying about precisely that question, whether Coldwater Ridge's whole future now rested on 9 years of brake jobs and thermos coffee, and Everett had clearly anticipated the worry and moved to close it off before Walter even had to voice it. But then, Everett said, "For you personally, Walter, and your family, I want to do something separate from all of that, something that has nothing to do with the mill decision at all, because you did not know, for one single day of the last 9 years, that there was any mill decision riding on any of it. You fixed a poor old man's truck because you believed he was a poor old man plainly, and whatever I do next has to reflect the fact that your kindness was never conditional on any of this turning out to be real." He said he wanted to pay off the roof loan entirely, wanted to set up a fund that would cover whatever Sam needed to finish any further schooling he wanted to buy out the note on the shop's building itself so that Walter would never again spend a February afraid of the bank, and wanted, if Walter was willing to hear him out on the specifics later, to talk about something considerably larger involving the shop's future that he wasn't ready to lay out in full that same afternoon, in the middle of all this. And he said, his voice slowing down in the way that told Walter they'd arrived at the part he'd clearly rehearsed the least, that he wanted Walter to know there was no obligation attached to any of it, no expectation, nothing owed back, simply a debt Everett felt he'd been quietly accumulating for 9 winters and finally had the chance to acknowledge. Walter did not say yes that afternoon. I think that matters as much as anything else in this story, and it is precisely the kind of thing that does not surprise a single person who has ever known Walter Brennan for longer than an afternoon. He sat with it, thanked Everett plainly, told him he needed to talk it over with Nadine before he could say anything at all about numbers that size. And Everett, who by every account respected that instinct more than almost anything else Walter could have said in that moment, told him to take all the time he needed, that he wasn't going anywhere, and that he'd very much like, if Walter would allow it, to keep coming by the shop occasionally, even now that the truth was out. Because in 9 years, that garage had become the only place in his entire life where he simply got to be a man with a truck, and he wasn't ready to lose that just because the coat had come off. Walter told him, of course, and Everett did come back the following week in a newer truck this time, considerably less broken down, and made a small joke about Walter finally getting to charge him full price for something. And Walter laughed harder than the joke probably deserved, mostly out of the sheer relief of the whole thing settling into something that still, underneath it all, resembled the friendship it had always actually been. Walter drove home that first evening in a fog he later described as feeling like driving through a snowstorm with your headlights on high beam, everything lit up too bright and somehow harder to see through because of it. Nadine was at the kitchen table grading spelling tests when he came in and took one look at his face and said, "Walt, what happened?" And Walter sat down across from her, in the kitchen where they'd sat across from each other for 18 years of ordinary evenings, and told her everything. The name, the article, the 3 towns, the 9 years, the mill, all of it tumbling out of him in an order that made, by his own admission, very little sense at first. And Nadine sat perfectly still through the whole thing, her red grading pen still capped in one hand. And when he finally finished, she was quiet long enough that Walter said, "Nadine, say something." And she said very softly, "Walt, that man's truck, the blue one. That's been Everett Holloway's truck this whole time." And Walter said, "Yeah." And Nadine put her head down on the table for a second, not crying exactly, just absorbing it physically the way you absorb a piece of news too large to process sitting upright. And then she lifted her head and said, "The thing I keep thinking about, Walt, is all those years I never once worried about whether we could afford what you were doing for him, because it never occurred to me to doubt you. And now I find out there was $300 million sitting on the other side of that decision the whole time. And somehow that doesn't feel like it changes what the decision actually was. It was still just you, being decent to a man in a bad coat. The money's just what happened to be underneath the coat. I don't think it changes the shape of what you did at all." They sat at that same kitchen table until well past midnight, the way Walter told me they hadn't done since the early lean years of their marriage, working through what Everett had actually offered. And I think the shape of that conversation matters more than any of the specific numbers that came out of it. Nadine, ever the teacher, made Walter write 2 lists on a legal pad, one of what scared them about all this and one of what they actually wanted. Because, she said, "We should know what we're afraid of before we decide what we're asking for, or we'll end up choosing things out of fear instead of out of any real desire." The fear list came easily and ran long. What if Sam grows up? Or rather, what if Sam, already grown, starts to think money solves problems instead of hard work solving them? What if people in town start treating us different, not badly, just different, like we're not quite the Brennans anymore? What if Walter has to explain to every single customer, whoever hears about this, why he deserved it, when he never once thought he was doing anything to deserve anything? What if the shop stops feeling like Dell's shop and starts feeling like a stage set for a story people want to hear about? The want list, by contrast, was almost embarrassingly short. They wanted the roof loan gone, plainly, because it was real weight they carried every month. They wanted Sam to have the option of further schooling without worrying about the cost, whatever he chose to do with it. They wanted, Walter admitted, a little sheepishly, for Gus to finally get the raise Walter had been meaning to give him for 3 years and never quite found the margin for. And they wanted the shop, the actual building, Dell's cinder block building with the wood stove in the corner, to still exist for their grandchildren someday, regardless of what happened to Walter's own knees the way it had happened to Dell's. That was the whole list, 4 items against a fear list nearly 3 times as long, and Nadine looked at that lopsided piece of paper and said, I think this is either proof we're going to be fine with whatever comes next, or it's the last honest conversation we have before all this changes us anyway." And Walter said, "Let's go with the first one." And Nadine said, "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." Walter called Everett 2 days later and read him almost exactly that legal pad, the fear list and the want list both, because he didn't want to negotiate the way you negotiate with somebody selling you something. He wanted Everett to understand the actual shape of what he and Nadine could hold on to without it changing who they were. Everett listened without interrupting the whole way through, and when Walter finished, he was quiet long enough that Walter asked if he was still on the line, and Everett said, "Walter, in 40 years of running that company, I've negotiated with executives who wanted 7 figures and dressed their fear up as ambition to make it sound sharper in a boardroom. You just read me a fear list longer than your want list, unprompted, and asked for considerably less than I'd already decided to give you before you called. I'm going to give you almost exactly what's on that second list, Walter. No more. Because you're the only man I've told this to in 9 years of testing strangers, who correctly understood that more isn't automatically the same thing as better. And that, more than the mill, more than any of it, is the moment I decided you were exactly the kind of steward I want, looking after that shop for the next chapter of it." The mill announcement itself moved forward through zoning boards and county commissioners over the following weeks, the way these things move, culminating in a genuinely thrilling town meeting held in the gymnasium of Coldwater Ridge Regional High School, the same gymnasium where Sam had played junior varsity basketball badly for 2 forgettable seasons a few years back. The town select board chair, a tired, decent woman named Ruth Callahan, who had been trying to attract any kind of major employer to Ashcombe County for the better part of a decade without success, stood up at that podium with her voice actually catching partway through and announced that Holloway County Holdings would be expanding its milling operations onto 40 acres of long vacant land at the north end of Route 4. A project expected to bring somewhere between 150 and 200 jobs to the region over the following 3 years. Walter sat in the third row between Nadine and Sam, with Gus 1 seat over looking, for possibly the first time anyone could remember, genuinely moved by something other than an engine running clean, and watched 300 of his neighbors erupt into the kind of noise that gymnasium had not held since the boys' basketball team made the state semifinals back in the 90s. Nobody in that room, except the 4 of them and Everett himself, sitting quietly near the back in a plain wool coat that nobody recognized without the truck parked outside, understood that the reason Holloway County Holdings had chosen this specific stretch of Route 4 over 2 other towns with comparable numbers on paper was sitting 3 rows from the front, a mechanic in a clean flannel shirt who had spent 9 winters fixing a stranger's truck without once wondering what, if anything, it might come back to him as. Walter caught Everett's eye once, across that packed gymnasium, and Everett gave him the smallest, barely perceptible nod, the kind 2 men share when they both know something the room doesn't, and Walter nodded back, and neither of them said a word about it to anyone else that night, letting the town have its own uncomplicated version of the good news, jobs coming to Coldwater Ridge, plain and simple, the way it deserved to be celebrated without any complicated strings attached in the public telling of it. I wish I could tell you the story more or less ends there, at the gymnasium, with the applause and Ruth Callahan's cracking voice and Nadine gripping Walter's hand hard enough to leave a mark. But it doesn't, and I promised myself in deciding to tell this story at all that I'd tell the whole of it, including the 8 weeks that followed, which were, without exaggeration, the hardest 8 weeks of Walter Brennan's adult life, harder in their own particular way than any of the lean winters that came before them. Because money, it turns out, does not arrive quietly into a small town, and it did not arrive quietly this time either. It arrived with a noise entirely its own, and that noise eventually reached the one place none of the Brennans had ever expected it to reach, which was the boardroom of Holloway County Holdings, 2 hours south in Concord, and the 2 adult children of Everett Holloway, a son named Russell and a daughter named Diane, neither of whom Walter had ever met, and neither of whom, it turned out, had any intention of quietly accepting that their father had handed a rural mechanic what Russell Holloway's own attorney would later describe in an actual legal filing as an amount of money and influence wildly disproportionate to any rational commercial relationship. Walter found out about it, as these things tend to arrive now, from a phone call from someone who'd already read it online before Walter had any idea it existed. Ruth Callahan called him at 6:30 one morning, her voice tight in a way he'd never heard from her before, and told him he needed to look at something before he opened the shop that day. She sent him a link to an article on a regional business news site, headline reading something close to Holloway family questions chairman's judgment amid reports of secret payments to rural mechanic. The article was careful, lawyerly careful, thick with the word alleged. But underneath the careful language, the story it told was simple and unkind. It suggested that Everett Holloway, 73 years old, a grieving widower for 9 years, had been exhibiting, in the words of an unnamed source close to the family, a pattern of increasingly erratic behavior, disappearing for stretches of time into rural communities, giving away substantial sums to strangers, and that this particular arrangement involving what the article called a Coldwater Ridge auto shop owner and his family had finally prompted his own children to formally raise questions through counsel about their father's capacity to continue managing his own affairs and the company's, the exact legal territory, though Walter did not fully understand this at the time, that families invoke when they intend to argue an elderly relative can no longer be trusted with his own decisions. Walter read that article standing in his own kitchen in his work coveralls, coffee going cold on the counter, Nadine reading it over his shoulder with a hand pressed flat against her own chest, and he told me later that what it felt like, reading it, was watching 9 years of quiet, unremarked kindness. Kindness he had genuinely never once connected to any expectation of return, get turned in the space of about 6 paragraphs, written by someone who had never once set foot in Ashcombe County, into a story about a scheming small-town operator who'd somehow worked an old man for his fortune. Walter had never asked Everett Holloway for a single dollar in 9 years. If anything, he'd spent 2 full days pushing back on the scale of what Everett wanted to give him. And now there was a version of events circulating in the world, with his actual name in it, Walter Brennan, that painted him as precisely the kind of man his own father had spent 30 years teaching him never to become. Sam found his parents still standing there when he came down for his own coffee before the morning shift, and Walter watched his son's face travel the same road his own had, shock. Then something close to a protective fury Walter had genuinely never seen in his son's 22 years, and Sam said, "Dad, this isn't right. Somebody needs to fix this." And Walter said, "Sam, I've spent my whole life fixing things I understand the insides of. I don't understand the insides of this yet, and until I do, we're not doing anything except going into work and doing our jobs the way we always have, because that much, at least, I know how to do correctly." It was, Nadine told me later, one of the more quietly remarkable things she'd ever watched her husband do. Hold steady in the middle of the worst morning of his adult life, simply because he'd decided panic wasn't going to be useful to anybody in his own kitchen at 7 in the morning. Walter called Everett's direct line, the number Everett had given him weeks earlier, and told him to use for anything at all. "Hands," Nadine said, visibly unsteady enough that he misdialed once, and when Everett picked up, his voice sounded older than Walter had heard it since that very first snowy Tuesday 9 years back, worn down in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with a fight he'd clearly been having out of Walter's sight for several days before it broke into the open. Everett told him, and Walter believed every word of it, that Russell and Diane had known in general terms about their father's habit of disappearing into small towns for years, had tolerated it as the eccentricity of a grieving man they didn't fully understand but had chosen not to fight, right up until the moment it involved a meaningful transfer of assets and a facility decision touching the company's own bottom line, at which point eccentricity became, in their attorney's careful language, a pattern consistent with diminished capacity. Russell in particular, Everett said quietly, had never forgiven him for the specific way he'd grieved Marion, had wanted his father to mourn properly and privately for some reasonable interval and then return fully to the boardroom the way a Holloway was supposed to, and had watched instead, with a resentment that had clearly been building for the better part of a decade. As his father wandered off in an old coat to towns his own children couldn't have located on a map without help. And now, Everett said, his voice catching in a way Walter had never once heard from him, now they've found the perfect vehicle for a fight they've wanted to have with me for 9 years. And I am deeply sorry, Walter, that my own grief and my own decisions have landed on your family's doorstep in the shape of a headline you did absolutely nothing to earn. The following weeks were, by Walter's own account, the strangest stretch of his life, stranger even than the afternoon he learned who Everett actually was, because that afternoon had been surreal in a wondrous, disorienting way, and this was surreal in a frightening one. A regional television van actually parked outside Brennan's Auto and Diesel one gray morning, and Gus Petrakis, 6'4" and built like the transmissions he rebuilds, walked out to that van personally and told the reporter. In a version of the exchange Sam recounted afterward with enormous relish, that she could either bring her vehicle in for an honest oil change, like a normal customer, or get it off the gravel before he called Sheriff Denny Marsh, who happened to be his own second cousin and owed him a favor from a plow truck repair the previous winter. Sam came home from a shift at the parts counter in town one afternoon and told his parents that a fellow he vaguely knew had made some comment online about the Brennans scamming a sick old man. And Walter sat him down that night at the same kitchen table and said, "Plainly, the truth is simple, Sam. I fixed a man's truck because he needed it fixed and couldn't pay full price for 9 years, and none of that changes because of what came after. Anybody who tells you different is choosing an easier story than the true one, and you don't owe an easier story your attention." What Walter did not expect, in the middle of all that noise, was the specific kindness of his own town rising up to meet it. Ruth Callahan, having broken the news to him that first morning, spent the better part of a week fielding calls from regional and even a couple of national outlets on Walter's behalf, without being asked, simply saying in her own steady way that she'd known Walter Brennan her whole life, and there wasn't an ounce of scheme in the man, and that anyone printing otherwise ought to come up and actually meet him before they kept writing about him. Marsh Petrakis, whose transmission Walter and Gus had rebuilt 2 nights straight, 2 winters back for a fraction of its worth, drove down from his dairy farm and sat in the shop's waiting area for 3 straight afternoons that week, ostensibly waiting on an oil change that kept mysteriously not being ready, but really, as he told Nadine plainly, just so Walter wouldn't be sitting in an empty shop alone with his own thoughts if a reporter did show up. An old regular named Curtis Ames, who plows half of Route 4 every winter and has used Brennan's for 20 years, started telling anyone who'd listen at the hardware store that he'd personally watched Walter Brennan waive off payment for stranded strangers more times than Curtis could count, long before there was ever a rich man's truck involved in any of it, and that this whole business was exactly who Walter had always been, and exactly why the town ought to be defending him instead of gossiping about him. Russell Holloway himself came to the shop in person about 10 days after the article broke, driving up in a black sedan that looked profoundly out of place on the gravel lot, wearing a wool overcoat that had clearly never once encountered actual New Hampshire road salt. Walter was under a farm truck when the bell over the office door rang, and Sam came to fetch him, saying only quietly, "Dad, there's a fella out front asking for you. Says his name's Holloway." And Walter felt something in his stomach drop, because he understood immediately, from the flat, careful way Sam said it, that this was not Everett. Russell was perhaps 50, lean, sharp-featured in a way that echoed his father's, without any of the softness age and grief had worn into Everett's face, and he did not offer a handshake. He said, without much preamble, "Mr. Brennan, I'll be direct with you, because I understand directness is something you value. My father is not well. He has not been well since my mother passed, and for 9 years he's been indulging some kind of extended crisis by playing at poverty in towns like this one. And you are, whether you intended it or not, the single largest financial consequence of that crisis to date." I'd like to understand what, exactly, you believe you're entitled to, and I'd like you to understand that my sister and I intend to pursue every legal avenue available to protect our father's estate, which was built, incidentally, by 3 generations of Holloways, not by a mechanic on Route 4. Walter, to his enormous credit, according to both Sam and Gus, who were both standing close enough to hear every word, did not raise his voice at all. He wiped his hands on his shop rags slowly, the way he does when he's deciding exactly how to say something correctly, and said, "Mr. Holloway, I understand you're scared for your father, and for what it's worth, I think that's a decent instinct, even if I think you've got the wrong man standing in front of you to be scared of. I never asked your father for $1 in 9 years. I fixed his truck because it needed fixing and he couldn't always pay for it, same as I've done for half this county at one point or another. Ask anybody on this road. Whatever he wants to do with his own money is between him and you and whatever lawyers you've got, and I genuinely mean that. I'm not looking to fight you over it. But I'll tell you plainly, the same way I told him plainly the day he told me who he was, I never once did a single thing for that man expecting it to come back to me as anything. And I'm not going to start defending myself now like I did because I didn't. And I won't pretend otherwise just because you showed up angry about it." Russell studied him for a long moment, the particular scrutiny of a man used to reading people for a living, and said, "My father's lawyers tell me you refused, twice, to accept the full amount he first offered. Walter said that's true. Russell said, why? And Walter said, because it was more than we needed, and taking more than you need off a grieving man isn't help. It's just a different kind of taking. And Russell Holloway, for the first time in that whole conversation, went quiet in a way that seemed to catch even him slightly off guard. He left without saying much else, but Sam told me afterward that something in his face had shifted on the way out the door. Not softened exactly, but shifted, the look of a man who had come prepared for a fight and found, instead, something considerably harder to argue with, which was simply a man telling the truth plainly and not needing anything from him in return. Diane Holloway Pierce, Everett's daughter, came separately about a week later, and the visit could not have unfolded more differently. She called ahead first, which Russell had not bothered to do, and asked if she could come by not as an adversary but, in her words, as a daughter trying to understand her father, and Walter, who has never once turned away a person asking for something reasonable, said, of course. She sat in the same good chair by the wood stove that Everett had occupied for 9 winters, and she cried within the first 5 minutes, not performing it, just quietly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand and apologizing for it, and told Walter that she had spent 9 years genuinely afraid her father was slowly losing his mind, watching him vanish for stretches with no explanation, watching him come back thinner and quieter each time, and that the version of events in that article had felt to her, at the time, like the only story that made sense of 9 years of behavior that had frightened her badly. Walter listened to all of it without interrupting, the same courtesy he'd have extended any customer explaining a problem, and when she finished, he said, "Mrs. Pierce, I think you and I have actually been worried about the exact same thing this whole time, just from opposite ends of it. You've been scared your father was falling apart. I've been scared I was going to get blamed for something I never did. Neither one of us was ever actually the problem. I think the problem was just distance and grief, and nobody in your father's corner able to tell you what was actually happening to him out here every December." He told her then, plainly, about the meatloaf, or rather, about the truck, about Marion picking the color because it hid the mud better, about the thermos of coffee in the wood stove and 9 years of a grieving man getting to be. One afternoon, a winter, simply a fellow with a broken truck instead of a chairman everyone wanted something from. Diane cried harder at that and said, quietly, "He never told us that. Any of it. We knew about the truck, but we never knew why it mattered to him." And Walter said, "I don't think he was ready to explain it to anybody who might have tried to take it away from him. And I think, if you want my honest opinion, ma'am, the kindest thing you could do for your father right now isn't a lawsuit. It's asking him to tell you the story himself, the whole of it, the way he told it to me. Diane Holloway Pierce left that afternoon considerably different than she'd arrived, and within 2 weeks, without any prompting from Walter at all, she had quietly withdrawn her name from the capacity petition her brother's lawyers had filed, a fact Walter only learned about afterward from Everett himself, sitting once again by that same wood stove. Russell did not withdraw quite so easily, and for a stretch of about 3 weeks it looked, by Everett's own account, genuinely possible that the petition would proceed to an actual hearing before a probate judge in Concord, a prospect that filled Walter with a specific dread he found difficult to name, not fear for his own finances, since he'd never once treated Everett's money as his to count on, but fear for what a public hearing would do to a man who had spent 9 years quietly rebuilding his own capacity for trust, only to have it argued over in a courtroom by his own son. Everett told Walter during one of several phone calls that stretch of weeks that he intended to attend any hearing personally, to testify himself if it came to that, and to bring, if the court allowed it, the actual maintenance records from Brennan's Auto and Diesel spanning 9 years, invoices and work orders that would show, in Everett's words, a considerably more coherent through line than erratic behavior, a man testing something real and finding it consistently in the same shop, from the same family, over nearly a decade. It did not come to that in the end, though it came closer than anyone but Everett's own lawyer ever fully knew. Diane, having withdrawn her own name, spent a good portion of those 3 weeks working on her brother directly, not through lawyers, but through the kind of long, difficult phone calls only a sister can really make. And what finally moved Russell, according to what Everett told Walter afterward, was not any legal argument at all. It was Diane telling her brother, plainly, that she had sat in that garage and heard, for the first time in 9 years, an actual explanation for their father's disappearances that made him sound not like a man losing his grip, but like a man who had, in his own quiet, strange way, been grieving their mother more honestly than either of his own children had managed to, and that continuing to fight it in a courtroom risked proving, permanently, to the one parent they had left, that they'd rather win an argument than understand him. Russell withdrew the petition on a Tuesday in early spring, 9 years and 4 months, by Walter's own careful count. Since that first snowy afternoon, the blue Ford had rattled into the lot. He called Walter directly to do it, which surprised Walter considerably, and the conversation was short, almost stiff. But it was, Walter told Nadine that night, the first entirely honest thing Russell Holloway had said to him since the day he'd stood on that gravel lot in his wool overcoat. He said, "Mr. Brennan, I withdrew the petition this morning. I want you to know that doesn't mean I've entirely made peace with any of this. But my sister made me understand something I hadn't let myself consider, which is that I've spent 9 years angry at my father for grieving my mother in a way I didn't recognize. Instead of asking him what it actually looked like from the inside, and you, apparently, are the only person he let see that. I don't fully understand why it was you, specifically, out of every stranger in every town he could have chosen. But I've decided that's not actually my business to understand, it's his." And Walter, in the flat, decent way he answers most things, said, "Mr. Holloway, for what it's worth, I think your father would tell you the door's still open if you ever wanted to hear it from him instead of from me." And Russell was quiet for a moment and said, "I think I might take him up on that," and hung up before either of them had to find a more comfortable way to end the call. I want to go back and describe the middle stretch of those 8 weeks more fully because I've told you the headline of it, the article and the television van and Russell's visit and the eventual withdrawal, but I skipped past something that mattered enormously to Walter at the time, which was what all of it did to the actual business of Brennan's Auto and Diesel while it was happening, because a small garage in a small town survives on reputation in a way that has nothing to do with legal filings and everything to do with whether people trust you with the one vehicle standing between them and getting to work. And for about 3 of those 8 weeks before Curtis Ames and Ruth Callahan and half the county rallied around him the way they eventually did, there was a real, frightening dip in the shop's regular traffic, a handful of longtime customers who quietly took their oil changes elsewhere that month. Not out of malice exactly. Walter has always been careful to say, but out of the particular small-town caution people apply to anything that smells, even faintly, like trouble they don't want their own name near. Sam noticed it first, doing the books the way he'd started doing more and more of, and came to Walter one evening with the receipts laid out on the counter and said, "Dad, we're down almost 30% this month." And Walter felt, for one brief, dizzying moment, the specific vertigo of watching something Everett's fortune could have fixed with a single phone call threatened to undo. Quietly and locally, everything Del Brennan had spent 30 years building on that stretch of Route 4. He did not call Everett about it. That detail matters more than almost any other in this whole account, because it would have been the easiest thing in the world to do, and Walter, watching 30 years of his father's reputation wobble under a story that wasn't even true, chose instead to do the only thing he actually knew how to do, which was show up every single morning, open both bays on time, and fix whatever came through the door as well and as honestly as he always had, and trust that the truth, given enough time and enough of his own steady behavior to stand next to it, would eventually out-argue the headline. Nadine has told me since that this was, in her opinion, the single most quietly heroic stretch of Walter's entire life, harder in its way than any of the lean winters, because it required him to hold his nerve in public, in front of the whole town, without the comfort of a wrench in his hand, solving something concrete in front of him. Gus, for his part, simply worked harder that month than Walter had ever seen him work, taking on extra hours without being asked, telling Sam once, quietly, that a Petrakis doesn't watch a Brennan's shop go under over a lie some city reporter printed without ever driving up here to check it, not while there's still gas in his own truck to get to work every morning. The turn came, as these things often do in a place like Coldwater Ridge, from an entirely unglamorous direction. Curtis Ames, the plow driver, wrote a long, unpolished comment underneath the original online article, using his actual name, describing in plain, specific detail 4 separate occasions over 20 years where Walter Brennan had fixed his plow truck for next to nothing during exactly the kind of hard winter that would have put Curtis out of work entirely without it, and ended the comment by saying, and I remember this phrasing because half the town repeated it to Walter afterward, with something like pride, "You people writing this story don't know Walter Brennan from Adam, and I've known him my whole life, and I'll tell you for free what took your reporter 6 paragraphs to get wrong. That man doesn't do anything for an angle. He just doesn't know how to watch somebody struggle without doing something about it. And if that's a crime now, half this county's guilty of it right alongside him." The comment got shared, then picked up by a smaller, more careful local paper that actually sent a reporter up to Coldwater Ridge in person, who spent 2 full days interviewing Ruth Callahan and Marsh Petrakis and a dozen other longtime customers, and who wrote, eventually, a considerably more accurate piece that made its way back into the same regional circulation the original story had come from. This time under a headline closer to the truth, something like Small-Town Mechanics' 9 Years of Quiet Kindness Behind Contested Billionaire Gift. That second article did not undo every doubt overnight, but it turned the tide, slowly, the way tides actually turn, and within a month the shop's regular customers had mostly drifted back, a little sheepish in some cases, Walter says, but back all the same, and by the time Russell withdrew his petition, Brennan's Auto and Diesel was, once again, simply the busy, ordinary garage on Route 4 it had always been. With the petition withdrawn and the noise finally settling, Everett and Walter sat down together at the same wood stove where nearly everything in this story had actually happened, to finally work out the specifics of what Everett had spent 8 weeks wanting to give, and Walter had spent 8 weeks too consumed with defending his own name to properly consider. Everett brought his own accountant this time, a careful, soft-spoken woman named Ilsa Reyes, who Walter liked immediately for the simple reason that she asked more questions about what Walter actually wanted than about what Everett was prepared to spend, and together the 3 of them worked out an arrangement considerably more modest than Everett's first instinct, and considerably more durable, Walter has always maintained, for exactly that reason. The roof loan was paid off outright. a genuine relief that Walter says still catches him some mornings. The specific absence of a bill he'd carried so long, he'd half forgotten it was optional. Sam's schooling, should he ever want more of it, was fully funded through a trust that required no justification and no timeline, an open door rather than an obligation. Gus finally got the raise Walter had been meaning to give him for 3 years, backdated, at Everett's insistence, a full year, which Gus accepted with his usual flat calm and then went home and, according to his brother Marsh, cried for the first time either of them could remember. And rather than simply handing Walter a lump sum for the shop itself, which Walter had pushed back on twice already and continued to push back on a third time, Everett proposed something different, a genuine partnership, Holloway County Holdings buying a minority stake in Brennan's Auto and Diesel, structured specifically so that Walter retained full operational control and the Brennan name stayed on the sign. But with enough capital behind it now to finally build the third bay Walter had wanted for over a decade, to buy the diagnostic equipment that kept the shop competitive against dealerships 30 miles away, and to guarantee, in writing, that no future February would ever again come down to a choice between the tow truck and the mortgage. Walter told me that the moment he actually agreed to that arrangement, sitting by the stove with Ilsa Reyes's paperwork spread across the same folding table where Everett used to eat nothing while pretending his truck needed more time, felt less like the end of a strange ordeal and more like the actual, proper beginning of something his own father would have recognized and approved of. A shop still run by a Brennan, still smelling of motor oil and burnt coffee, simply no longer one bad winter away from not existing at all. Russell Holloway came to the shop himself about 3 weeks after withdrawing the petition, and this time he came alone, in a plainer car, and he came, he told Walter at the door, not to talk business at all, but because his father had finally told him the whole story. The rainy Tuesday 9 years back, the coat, the truck, Marion's insistence on the color that hid the mud, all of it. In a long conversation the two of them had had over dinner in Concord the week before. The first real dinner, Russell admitted, that he and his father had shared in longer than either of them wanted to say out loud. He asked Walter if he could see the shop, the actual bay where it had all happened, and Walter walked him through it, the lift, the wood stove, the folding chairs, the ancient parts calendar nobody had ever updated, and Russell stood by that stove for a long moment, the same spot where his father had sat through 9 winters of thermos coffee and said quietly, "I think I understand now why this specific chair mattered to him more than anything in our house in Concord ever did." And Walter, watching him, said, "It's just a chair by a stove, Mr. Holloway, but I think your father needed one of those a great deal more than he needed most of what he already had." Russell asked, before he left that day, whether he could come back sometime, not as Everett's son checking up on an arrangement, but simply, he said, a little awkwardly, as somebody who wanted to understand a place that had apparently mattered to his father more than 4 decades of boardrooms had. And Walter told him the door was always open, the same thing he'd have told anybody, and Russell did come back, twice more that spring, sitting quietly by the stove while Walter and Sam worked, mostly listening, and on his 3rd visit he brought his own teenage son, a boy named Peter, who had never once met his grandfather outside of holidays in a suit, and watched the boy's face change slowly over an afternoon as Everett, there that same day by coincidence, showed his grandson how to check a dipstick properly, an image Walter says he still thinks about often, 3 generations of a family finally sitting in the same low-ceilinged garage together, for no reason at all except that it turned out to be a good place to sit. I asked Walter once, much later, whether he'd ever resented Russell for that first visit, the wool overcoat, the cold accusation about entitlement, and Walter thought about it for a while before answering, in the careful way he answers most things that matter to him, and said, "No, not really. Scared people say scared things, and that man was watching his father give away pieces of an empire his own grandfather built, to a stranger he'd never met, and I think if it had been my own father doing something that looked that reckless to me, I might have shown up angry too. I didn't need him to apologize. I just needed him to eventually ask the right question instead of the wrong one, and he got there. Most people do, eventually, if you give them room to. Everett told Walter more about Marion over that spring than he'd told anyone outside his own family in the 9 years since her passing, and Walter has shared some of it with me because he says he thinks it's the part of the story that explains everything else, if you're willing to sit with it long enough. Marion Holloway had been, by every account, nothing like the woman Everett's own board had expected their chairman to marry, a school teacher's daughter from a small town 2 hours from Ashcombe, met at a county fair of all places, back when Everett was still driving his own father's delivery truck for the original sawmill, and had considerably less to his name than the girl selling pie at the church booth, where he'd first struck up a conversation about, of all things, the correct ratio of cinnamon to nutmeg. She had married him before the company had grown into anything resembling what it eventually became, and Everett told Walter, more than once, that he suspected some part of him had spent the following 4 decades quietly terrified that the growing company would somehow change what she'd originally seen in him. A fear he never fully shook even after 30-some years of marriage had proven it groundless every single day. Marion got sick 11 years ago, a diagnosis Everett still won't specify beyond calling it a long illness. And the 2 years that followed were, he told Walter, both the hardest and in some strange way the most honest 2 years of his entire marriage, because for the first time in decades neither of them had the energy left to perform anything for the board or the town or anyone else watching. They simply had each other, and a house that got quieter every month, and a truck, the same blue Ford that Marion insisted on riding in every Saturday for as long as her strength allowed, because she said, and Everett repeated this to Walter with his voice audibly unsteady, the one time he told it in full, she said, "Everett, I don't want to spend whatever time I've got left riding around in something that looks like your money. I want to ride around in something that looks like us." Marion passed on a Tuesday in late autumn, 9 years before that first snowy afternoon at Brennan's, and Everett told Walter that the single hardest part of the entire ordeal of grief that followed was not the funeral or the condolence cards from board members he suspected didn't actually know his wife's middle name. It was the specific realization, some months later, that he could no longer tell whether anyone in his daily life was being kind to him because they cared or because he still signed their paychecks, and that Marion had been the last honest mirror he had, and without her, he genuinely no longer knew what his own reflection looked like. That, Everett told Walter, was the actual seed of everything that followed. The disappearing, the old coats, the small towns, not a business strategy dressed up as eccentricity, the way Russell's lawyers had tried to frame it, but a grieving man trying to find, in the only way he could think to try, some proof that the version of decency Marion had shown him at a county fair pie booth still existed somewhere in the world, uncomplicated by his own money, and that he might still be capable of recognizing it and receiving it without an angle attached. Walter told me that hearing all of this, finally, in full, made something click into place about 9 years of December visits that he'd never quite understood before, which was that Everett hadn't simply been testing Walter's kindness all those years. He'd been quietly, desperately hoping to find it, the way you hope for something you're not sure still exists. And that hope, Walter says, is a considerably heavier thing to have been carrying in a threadbare coat than anyone watching from the outside could have guessed. The groundbreaking for the new mill came that same spring, on a Saturday morning bright enough that the last of the roadside snowbanks had finally gone entirely to gray slush, and it drew, by Ruth Callahan's later count, close to 600 people to the 40 vacant acres at the north end of Route 4, easily the largest single gathering Coldwater Ridge had seen since the paper mill's own closing 2 decades back. A fact several people pointed out with a kind of aching irony that Ruth addressed directly in her remarks, saying that a town doesn't get many chances to watch a door open again in the same rough shape as one that closed on it years before, and that Coldwater Ridge intended to hold on to this one properly. Everett Holloway stood at that podium himself, not in a charcoal suit, but in a plain wool coat, considerably nicer than the canvas one Walter had known him in, but a clear and deliberate step down from what his own board would have preferred him wearing for regional television cameras. And he gave a short speech that mentioned Holloway County Holdings only twice, and mentioned, by name, Brennan's Auto and Diesel 4 separate times, describing it in a phrase the local paper picked up and ran as its own headline the following week, as the truest due diligence report his company had ever commissioned, conducted entirely without spreadsheets, over 9 winters, by a mechanic who never once knew he was being asked a question at all. Walter stood near the back of that crowd with Nadine's hand in his, and Sam on his other side, and Gus somewhere behind them, complaining, not entirely seriously, about missing a Saturday of actual work for a bunch of speeches, and watched Everett Holloway point directly at him in front of 600 of his own neighbors and say, "That man right there taught me more about what this company ought to actually be for than 4 decades of board meetings ever managed to, and I owe him, and this whole town, considerably more than a mill, though the mill is the part I actually know how to build, so it'll have to do for a start." The applause that followed, Nadine told me afterward, was different in character from the gymnasium applause months earlier, quieter, more sustained, the specific sound of a room that had heard by then the fuller version of the story, at least enough of it to understand what it was actually applauding. Diane Holloway Pierce attended that groundbreaking too, standing near her father the whole ceremony, and Russell came as well, with his son Peter beside him. And Walter told me that watching the 4 of them, Everett and his 2 grown children and 1 teenage grandson, standing together at the edge of that muddy field on a bright, cold Saturday, felt like watching the actual, quieter groundbreaking underneath the official one, a family finally starting to build something back that had been sitting half-collapsed for the better part of a decade, long before any of them understood there was anything wrong with the foundation at all. I want to tell you a little more about Gus Petrakis here, because I think his part in this story deserves more room than a single mention of a raise, and because Walter has always insisted, whenever he tells this whole account, that none of it would have gone the way it did without Gus standing quietly in the corner of it the entire time. Gus is 51 now, has worked at Brennan's since he was 19, first hired by Dell himself, and has, for reasons Walter has never fully pried into out of the same instinct that kept him from prying into Everett's life, never married, never had children, and lives alone in a small house about a mile from the shop that he has, by his own cheerful admission, done almost no work on in the 30-some years he's owned it because he spends so much of his actual waking life inside the garage instead. Walter told me once that he suspects the shop is, in some real sense, the only family Gus ever really built for himself, and that watching Gus quietly protect Walter's name during those 8 hard weeks, taking extra shifts, standing up to a television reporter on the gravel lot, was not really about loyalty to Walter specifically, so much as it was about a man defending the one structure in his life that had ever actually held him. The raise Everett insisted on backdating a full year changed something for Gus that had nothing to do with the money itself, according to Marsh, who knows his brother better than anyone. For the first time in 3 decades, Gus started talking, quietly, about maybe finally fixing the roof on his own house, the one he'd let sit unrepaired for years because the shop's needs had always, in his own accounting, come first. Walter told him, when Gus mentioned it almost sheepishly one afternoon, that he ought to take a few days off to actually get quotes on it, and Gus looked at him for a long moment and said in his flat way, "Walt, I've worked here 32 years, and this is the first time you've ever told me to take a day off instead of asking if I could stay late." And Walter said, "Well, maybe it's time both of us learned how to do that." And Gus, after a pause, said, "Yeah, maybe it is." It's a small exchange in the grand shape of this whole story, but Walter has told me more than once that it's one of the moments he's proudest of out of the entire ordeal. Not the mill, not the money, just watching a man who'd quietly given the shop 30 years finally let the shop give a little back. I think it's worth pausing here, too, to tell you about the conversation Walter had with his own father's memory, if you can call it that, because Walter is not a man who talks about grief in any conventional sense, But he told me once, sitting by that same wood stove on an ordinary afternoon well after everything had settled, that he'd gone out to the small cemetery behind the Congregational Church, where Del Brennan is buried next to Walter's own mother, on the same evening Russell Holloway withdrew his petition, and stood there for a while in the cold, not really praying, he said, just talking, the way you talk to somebody who isn't going to answer but who you need to update anyway. He told his father about the whole thing, the truck, Everett, the mill, the newspaper article, all of it. And he said the thing he kept coming back to, standing there, was a specific memory of Del, maybe 15 years back, refusing to properly bill a logging outfit that had fallen behind during a bad stretch, and Walter, 17 at the time, asking him why, and Del saying, plain as anything, Walter. A shop that only helps people who can already afford to be helped isn't worth keeping the lights on for. And Walter told me that standing in that cemetery, he finally understood, in a way he hadn't quite let himself feel during the whole frightening ordeal, that everything he'd done for 9 years with Everett's truck hadn't been some accident of character. It had been, in the most literal sense, his father's actual voice, still running the shop through him, 15 years after Del stopped being able to say it out loud himself. There is one more piece of the middle of this story I need to tell you, because I think it's the part that surprised Walter most, more even than the money or the mill, which is what all of it did, quietly, to Sam. Sam had a girlfriend that year, a young woman named Priya Anand who worked at the regional hospital 40 minutes south as a physical therapy assistant while finishing her own degree part-time. And the two of them had been circling for the better part of a year a conversation about whether Sam would ever consider leaving Coldwater Ridge for a bigger market, a conversation Sam had been quietly avoiding because he loved the shop and loved his father and did not want to be the Brennan who finally broke the chain that had run from Del to Walter to him. When the news about Everett broke, and the shop's future suddenly felt considerably more secure than it ever had, Sam told his father, one evening after Priya had gone home, that some part of him had actually felt a strange grief underneath all the relief, because the specific story he'd always told himself about staying, that the shop needed him, that leaving would mean risking everything Del had built, had suddenly gotten a great deal less true. And he didn't quite know, for the first time in his adult life, whether staying was actually still what he wanted or just what he was used to wanting. Walter has told me that conversation frightened him more than the newspaper article had, in its own quiet way, because it forced him to consider, directly, whether 9 years of Everett's kindness and the sudden security that followed it might end up costing him the one thing none of Everett's money could ever replace, which was his own son standing beside him in that garage. He did not push Sam either direction. He told him instead, sitting in the same folding chairs where Everett had once explained who he really was, Sam, your grandfather built this place so that whoever ran it after him could choose to, not so that whoever came after him would feel trapped into it. If Priya wants a life 40 minutes south and you want a life with Priya, that's not you breaking anything. That's you building something new the same way he built this. I'd rather have a son who chose me some years, from somewhere else, than one who stayed out of guilt and slowly came to resent the stove and the lift and every one of these tools. Sam cried at that quietly, the way 22-year-old men cry when they've been given permission for something they didn't know they needed permission for, and told his father, eventually, after a few more weeks of thinking it over with Priya, that he wanted to stay, not because he had to anymore, but because when he actually let himself imagine a life without that garage in it, it felt smaller, not bigger. And Priya, as it turned out, was perfectly happy to finish her own degree and take a position at the smaller clinic in Coldwater Ridge itself, rather than the regional hospital, once she understood how much the choice actually meant to him. They got engaged that same autumn, in fact, at the same wood stove, a detail Walter still gets a little emotional describing, Sam having asked Everett, half joking and half not, whether he'd mind if a fourth generation of somebody got engaged in his old chair, and Everett saying it would be, in his words, the finest possible use anyone had ever proposed for that particular piece of furniture. The mill broke ground that spring and, true to Ruth Callahan's projections, was fully operational within 14 months, and by the time its first full winter of production rolled around, it employed 172 people directly, most of them from Coldwater Ridge or the towns immediately surrounding it, including, to Walter's considerable satisfaction, Curtis Ames's own grown son, who'd been commuting nearly an hour each way to a warehouse job in Concord and was able, for the first time in his adult life, to work 15 minutes from the house he'd grown up in. The old feed store on Main Street, closed for 6 years, reopened under new ownership within the first year of the mill's operation. A direct beneficiary, its new owner said publicly more than once, of the sudden influx of steady paychecks into a town that had been quietly bleeding its young people southward for 2 decades. Ruth Callahan, who had spent the better part of 10 years trying to attract exactly this kind of investment without success, told a reporter from that same, more careful local paper, the one that had eventually gotten the fuller story right, that Coldwater Ridge's turnaround would be taught someday in whatever the New Hampshire equivalent of a small-town economic development course looked like, and that the whole thing had started, improbably, with a mechanic who never once thought he was doing anything more than fixing a broken truck. 6 months after the groundbreaking, on a bright, cold morning in early winter, almost exactly 1 year after Everett had first told Walter the truth, the blue Ford made one final appearance at Brennan's Auto and Diesel, not for a repair this time, but because Everett wanted, he said, to give it a proper goodbye before it went where he'd finally decided it belonged, which was not a junkyard, and not a private collection, but the lobby of the new mill itself, restored, at Walter's own insistence and under Walter's own supervision, to the exact condition it had been in when Marion picked out the color that hid the mud, sitting now behind a modest plaque that read only, at Everett's specific request, nothing about billions or chairmen, simply, this truck spent 9 winters at Brennan's Auto and Diesel on Route 4, and it taught its owner more about the town of Coldwater Ridge than any report ever could. Walter did the restoration himself over several weekends, refusing payment for the labor in a small, quiet echo of the whole arrangement that had started this entire story, and Everett, watching him do it, told Nadine once that it was the closest thing to a perfect circle he'd ever personally witnessed. A man being paid, finally, in the exact same currency he'd spent 9 years giving away for free. I want to tell you about the second groundbreaking, too, if you can call it that, which happened almost 2 years after the first, when Holloway County Holdings, at Everett's specific direction and over what Walter later learned was some initial resistance from a few board members who thought the gesture unusual for a company of that size, established the Marion Holloway Community Fund, seeded with an amount large enough to generate meaningful annual grants, administered locally rather than out of the Concord headquarters, specifically for small businesses across Ashcombe County, facing exactly the kind of hard winter Brennan's Auto and Diesel had faced more than once over the years. No equity taken, no strings attached beyond a simple, honest accounting of need. Walter sits on the small local committee that reviews applications, an irony he still finds a little funny given how staunchly he resisted being singled out for any kind of special treatment himself, and he has told me that the single proudest moment of his involvement with that fund so far came the year they approved a grant for the same sandwich counter 2 towns over that Everett had once quietly tested during his early incognito years. The same one, it turned out, where an older woman had once covered his tab a single time, years before he ever found Booth 6, or rather Bay 1, at Brennan's. Everett had mentioned her once, in passing, during one of his long afternoon conversations with Walter, and when the woman's daughter, running the counter now that her mother had passed, applied to the fund for help replacing a failing walk-in cooler, Walter recognized the address immediately and made sure, personally, that the application moved through the committee without delay, a small, private thread of the story closing itself quietly, the way the best parts of it always seem to. Sam and Priya married the following June, in a ceremony in the same field behind Nadine's parents' old place, where Walter and Nadine themselves had married nearly 23 years earlier, folding chairs and a tent that, in a small detail everyone found funny in hindsight, leaked again in almost exactly the same spot around 6 in the evening, as though the tent itself had opinions about tradition. Everett attended, seated near the front at Walter's own specific insistence, in a plain gray suit rather than anything from his corporate wardrobe, and Walter asked him, a few weeks before the wedding, whether he'd consider saying a few words, and Everett, who by every account does not enjoy public speaking outside of the rare, necessary groundbreaking, agreed anyway and stood up during the reception with a glass of lemonade rather than champagne, since he'd long since given up drinking after Marion's illness, and said, "I've known this family for going on 11 years now, though for the first 9 of them I only let them know me back for about 40 minutes a year, in a cold garage, over a truck that kept finding new ways to fall apart. I want you all to know that those 40 minutes, every single year, were the only time in my whole calendar where nobody wanted anything from me except to fix a water pump and hear how my week was going. And I have come to believe, watching this family closely for 2 years now, that the entire secret of whatever they've built here, this shop, this marriage, this son standing up here in a suit that clearly does not fit him as well as his coveralls do, is simply that none of them have ever once confused generosity with foolishness. They give because giving is who they are, not because they expect an accounting of it later, and I happen to know, better than almost anyone alive, exactly how rare that actually is, and exactly how much it's worth. The room, Nadine told me, went entirely silent for a moment before the applause started, the specific silence of several hundred people recognizing they'd just heard something true. Russell and Diane both attended the wedding as well, seated with their own children among the guests rather than off to one side as any kind of special party, and Walter told me that watching Russell, of all people, dance with his own teenage son Peter during the reception, laughing at something Peter had clearly just said, felt like as complete a resolution as anything Everett's lawyers could ever have drafted. Diane brought her own husband, a quiet accountant named Marcus, who Walter liked instantly, for reasons he found difficult to articulate, beyond simply that the man asked good questions about carburetors, and the two families, Brennans and Holloways, spent that whole reception mixed together at the same long tables rather than clustered by name, which Nadine says was, more than any speech, the actual proof that something had genuinely healed rather than merely been legally resolved. I asked Walter once, sitting by that same wood stove on an ordinary Tuesday well over a year after everything had settled, whether he ever thought about what would have happened if he'd made a different choice that very first afternoon 9 years earlier, if he'd looked at a stranger patting his empty pockets and decided, reasonably, that the shop couldn't afford to extend that kind of grace to somebody he'd never met before. Walter thought about the question for a long time, turning a socket wrench over slowly in his hands the way he does when he's working through something that matters, and said, honestly, I don't think about it much, because I don't think I ever actually had a different choice available to me. Not really, not in any way that would have still let me be the same person my father raised. Dell didn't build this place so his son could learn to calculate who deserves help and who doesn't. He built it so I'd know, without having to think about it, that a fella with an empty pocket and a broke-down truck gets the same care as anybody else walking through that door, rich or poor, and you don't get to know in advance which one he actually is. I got lucky that the math worked out the way it did. But Walt, I want you to understand something, and this is the part I think people miss most when they hear this story secondhand. I'd have done exactly the same thing for Everett Holloway if he'd turned out to actually just be a broke old man with nothing behind that coat at all. That was never the part I was gambling on. That was never a gamble to begin with. There was a frightening stretch, I should tell you, about 2.5 years after that first revelation, when Everett's heart gave him some genuine trouble, an incident during a routine morning at his home in Concord that put him in the regional hospital for the better part of a week, a scare that Diane called Walter about directly at 6 in the morning in a tone that brought back, uncomfortably, the memory of Ruth Callahan's original call about the newspaper article. Walter and Nadine drove down that same morning, sitting for 2 hours in a hospital waiting room alongside Russell and Diane and Everett's grandson Peter, and Walter told me it was strange and oddly clarifying, sitting in molded plastic chairs with a family he'd known for barely 2 years at that point, but felt by then as tied to as almost anyone outside his own household, all of them united in the same specific fear that has nothing to do with money at all. The fear of losing somebody you've only recently learned how to actually keep. Everett recovered in the end, after a procedure his cardiologist described as more precautionary than critical, though the week itself did not feel precautionary to anyone sitting in that waiting room. And Walter was the first person outside the immediate family allowed back to see him once he was stable. Mostly. Diane told me later because Everett had specifically asked for him by name before he'd asked for almost anything else, including his own lawyer. Walter found him propped up in a hospital bed looking smaller than Walter had ever seen him, tubes and monitors doing the quiet, businesslike work of keeping an old man's heart on schedule. And Everett, seeing him, managed a thin smile and said in a voice considerably weaker than his usual clear cadence, "Well, Walter, I suppose this is one repair even you can't do in your own bay." And Walter, sitting down in the plastic chair beside the bed, said, "No, but I know some good mechanics in this building, so you're in decent hands." And Everett laughed, weakly, and then went quiet for a moment and said, "I want you to know something, while I've got the chance to say it properly instead of leaving it for somebody else to explain after the fact. 9 years in that coat, testing strangers, I always assumed I was looking for proof that decency without an angle still existed somewhere. I found that in you a long time ago now. What I didn't expect, and what I want you to know I'm grateful for every single day since, is that I also got my own children back in the process, and I don't believe that would have happened without you standing in the middle of all of it, refusing to take more than you needed and refusing to defend yourself with anything except the plain truth. You didn't just fix a truck for 9 winters, Walter. You fixed considerably more than that, and I don't think either of us fully understood at the time how much more it actually was." Walter told me that conversation is one he has never repeated in full to anyone except Nadine, not out of secrecy exactly, but because it felt, he said, like the kind of thing that loses something in the retelling if you say it too often, the way a good story sometimes does. And I've only included as much of it here as he was willing to share, which I take as a measure of how much he trusted me to tell the rest of this properly. Everett was discharged 5 days later, resumed a somewhat gentler schedule at Holloway County Holdings at his own doctor's insistence, and made a point that following December, nearly 3 years to the day since that first snowy Tuesday, of driving up to Coldwater Ridge personally, in a newer truck now but still dark blue, still his own choice of color, just to sit by the wood stove for an afternoon. No truck trouble at all this time, simply because, he told Walter, some appointments are worth keeping even after the original excuse for them has stopped existing. I think it's worth taking a moment here to describe what Coldwater Ridge itself actually looks like now, several years on, because I think the town's own transformation is, in its quiet way, as much a character in this story as any single person in it. The mill runs 3 shifts most months, considerably busier than the old paper mill ever managed in its final declining decade, and the parking lot outside it, empty gravel for the 2 years before the groundbreaking, now fills every morning with the trucks and sedans of workers who no longer have to commute out of the county for steady pay. The elementary school that Nadine has taught at for going on 20 years now, which had been quietly bracing for its own consolidation with a neighboring district right around the time all of this started, saw its enrollment stabilize and then grow slightly for the first time in over a decade, enough new families moving to town for mill jobs that the school board actually discussed, for the first time in Ruth Callahan's tenure, adding a classroom rather than cutting one. The hardware store on Main Street, which had been barely hanging on, now does brisk enough business that its owner, a woman named Odette Fournier, who Walter has known his whole life, told him last spring that she'd finally been able to hire a second full-time employee, a young man who, as it happens, is Curtis Ames's nephew. Home from 3 years working construction in Boston because Coldwater Ridge finally had something worth coming home for. Brennan's Auto and Diesel itself added that long-wanted third bay within the first year of the partnership with Holloway County Holdings, and business has grown enough, driven partly by mill workers needing their own vehicles serviced and partly by the shop's own considerably enhanced reputation, that Walter hired 2 additional mechanics beyond Gus and Sam, including, in a detail that pleases Walter enormously, a young woman named Kayla Doiron, who is, as far as anyone in town can determine, the first female mechanic Coldwater Ridge has ever had working on its trucks, and who Walter has said, more than once, reminds him of himself at 20, minus the family connection to the place, having simply shown up one day asking whether they were hiring and proving, within a week, that she could diagnose a failing alternator faster than either Sam or Gus. Nadine, for her part, made her own quiet decision about 2 years after everything settled, choosing to step back from full-time teaching to a part-time role, not because the money required it anymore, since it plainly no longer did, but because she wanted, she told Walter, the chance to actually be present for the specific ordinary moments of their own life that 14 years of grading papers on weekday evenings had always slightly crowded out. And she has spent the time since volunteering 2 mornings a week at the same elementary school, tutoring kids who are behind in reading, work she describes as the closest she's ever come to feeling like she's doing exactly what she was built to do, without the exhaustion of a full class list weighing against it. I asked her once whether it felt strange, having the option to step back at all, given how many years she'd spent without it, and she said, honestly, it felt strange for about a month. And then it just felt like breathing room, the specific kind you don't recognize you're missing until you finally have some. Every December since, without fail, on the anniversary of that first snowy Tuesday, Everett Holloway drives up to Brennan's Auto and Diesel, and the whole extended circle of this story, by now, has quietly turned it into something between a tradition and a small local holiday. Gus makes a point of having a full pot of proper coffee ready instead of the questionable shop pot, a running joke between him and Everett that started the very first year after the truth came out and has never once been allowed to lapse. Ruth Callahan usually stops by for at least 20 minutes, ostensibly on unrelated town business, though everyone understands she simply enjoys being near the origin point of the best thing that's happened to Coldwater Ridge in her adult lifetime. Curtis Ames has taken, the last 2 years running, to bringing a thermos of his own, a small, deliberate echo of Everett's original habit that nobody has ever directly commented on, but that everyone quietly understands the meaning of. Sam and Priya, who had their first child, a daughter named Dell after her great-grandfather, at the most recent gathering brought her along in a car seat set on the same folding chair where Everett once explained who he really was, and Everett, holding her for a few minutes while Sam refilled coffee, told Walter that it was, without exaggeration, one of the finest moments of his entire life. An infant girl named after the man whose decency had started this whole chain of events, sleeping soundly in the exact spot where that decency had finally been recognized for what it always was. I asked Walter, on the most recent of these December gatherings, now 5 years since that first article, and 9 years since Everett's original visit, whether he ever felt like the story had gotten away from him somehow, become bigger than the simple thing it actually was at its core. A man helping another man with a broken truck. He thought about it for a while, watching Gus pour coffee for Ruth Callahan while Nadine held her new granddaughter, and Everett sat, as he always does now, in that same good chair by the stove, and said, "No, I don't think it ever really got away from me, because I don't think the size of it ever actually changed. It was always just a fella helping another fella out. Everything else, the mill, the money, the newspaper trouble, Russell and Diane finding their way back to their father, all of it, That's just what happens sometimes when you let a simple thing keep being simple for long enough without deciding it needs to turn into something more complicated. People ask me sometimes if I do it differently, knowing now what I didn't know then, and the honest answer is no, not one single winter of it. Because the version where I knew who he really was the whole time isn't actually a better story. It's a worse one. The only reason any of this means anything at all is that I didn't know, and I did it anyway, and I think that's the whole lesson, if there's one to be had here at all. You don't get to know in advance who's worth being decent to. You just decide to be decent, and you let whatever comes back from it be whatever it's going to be. And mostly, in my experience, what comes back from it is simply more reasons to keep doing it. Nadine and Diane Holloway Pierce, of all the relationships that grew out of this strange chapter, became the one nobody quite expected. A genuine friendship that neither woman anticipated the first afternoon Diane sat crying in that garage. It started small, a phone call a few weeks after the petition was withdrawn, Diane wanting to properly thank Nadine for whatever it was Nadine had said to Walter that kept the whole family steady through the worst of it. And it grew over the following years into something considerably deeper, monthly lunches when schedules allowed, long phone calls about nothing in particular, the specific kind of friendship two women build when they discover, almost by accident, that they understand each other's exhaustions in a way most of their other friends don't quite manage to. Diane told Nadine once, over one of those lunches, that watching Nadine handle the sudden strangeness of Everett's revelation with as much steadiness as she had, without ever once losing herself in either the fear or the excitement of it, had taught Diane more about how to actually support her own father through the rest of his life than any of the family therapy sessions Russell had eventually, reluctantly, agreed to attend alongside her. Nadine, for her part, has told me that Diane's friendship gave her something she hadn't realized she was missing, a woman close to her own age who understood, from the opposite and considerably more complicated direction, what it felt like to watch enormous sums of money move through a family and try to keep the actual people underneath it from getting lost in the accounting. It was Diane, in fact, who eventually convinced her father to formalize something Everett had been doing informally for years by that point, folding his small-town testing habit into an actual structured program within the Marion Holloway Community Fund, one that Everett himself still occasionally participates in personally, though considerably less incognito than his original 9 years of solo travel, now bringing along a small team specifically tasked with identifying struggling local businesses across 3 counties that might benefit from the same kind of patient, no-string support Brennan's auto and diesel had once needed and never asked for. Everett told Walter, describing this new chapter of the work, that it felt different now, doing it openly rather than in disguise, less like a test and more like simply paying forward something he'd finally learned how to trust again. And Walter told him that struck him as exactly the right way to describe it. A man who'd spent 9 years looking for proof that decency existed without an angle, now spending his remaining years making sure that same decency had a little more room to survive its own hard winters. I asked Everett once, on one of those December visits, now considerably older, moving more slowly than ever but with a clarity in his eyes Walter says has never once dimmed, what he thought Marion would have made of all of it. The truck in the mill lobby, the fund bearing her name, the reconciliation with Russell and Diane, Sam's daughter sleeping in that same chair. He was quiet for a long moment, the particular stillness Walter has come to recognize as Everett, choosing his words with real care, and said, "I think she'd have found the whole thing a little embarrassing, honestly. All this fuss over what was, in the end, just a man being kind to another man about a broken truck. Marion never much cared for fuss. But I think, underneath the embarrassment, she'd have been the proudest of the fact that it took me 9 years in a bad coat to relearn something she always just seemed to know without having to go looking for it, which is that the only wealth actually worth protecting is the kind that doesn't disappear the moment you stop being able to prove it on paper. She had that kind of wealth her whole life, Walter, more of it than I've built in 4 decades of Holloway County holdings. and I spent a long time after she died mistaking my company's balance sheet for a replacement, before I finally understood it never could be one. Sam has told me, since becoming a father himself, that he thinks about this whole story differently now than he did as a 22-year-old standing in the corner of that garage watching his own father's life turn sideways in the space of a single afternoon. He said that holding his own daughter for the first time made him understand, in a way he hadn't fully grasped before, exactly what his father had actually been protecting all those years, not just a business, not just a family's finances, but a specific way of being in the world that he wanted to be able to hand down the same way Dell had handed it down to Walter. Sam has already started, in small ways, teaching little Dell the same lessons, letting her sit on the workbench in a car seat while he explains, mostly to himself since she's far too young to understand any of it yet, why a certain customer's bill is going to be a little lighter than it strictly should be this month. A habit Priya has told him, fondly, makes him sound exactly like his own father, which Sam says is the nicest thing anyone could tell him. I think about the whole arc of this story often, the accumulated weight of it. 9 winters of a mechanic quietly protecting a stranger's dignity without once wondering what might be underneath it. And I keep coming back to something Everett said to Walter near the end of one of their long December conversations by the stove, that I think captures the entire shape of what happened here better than anything else either man ever told me. Everett said, "Walter, I want you to understand something about the actual math of all this, because I think people who hear this story secondhand sometimes get the arithmetic backward. They hear that a poor mechanic ended up with a share of a fortune, and they assume the story is about what he gained. But the truth, if you look at it honestly, is that I spent 9 years testing an entire county for one single person who could still treat me like a man instead of a wallet. And I found exactly one out of every stranger I met in every disguise I wore across 4 different towns over the better part of a decade. You were the rarest thing I encountered in 9 years of very deliberately looking for it, Walter. And every dollar I've ever given you or your family is worth considerably less, in the actual accounting that matters, than what you gave me first, which was simply proof, delivered 40 minutes at a time, one December after another, that the thing I was afraid had gone extinct in the world actually hadn't. That's the real transaction here, if you want to call it that. I got the better end of it by a distance neither of us will ever be able to properly calculate. I want to close with the most recent December visit because I think it captures, better than any single moment before it, what this whole story actually settled into, once the noise of the newspaper article and the petition and the town meetings had all faded into the ordinary rhythm of a small town going about its business. It was an unremarkable Tuesday, cold but not bitterly so, the gravel lot at Brennan's Auto and Diesel half full of the usual mix of oil changes, and a farm truck waiting on a hydraulic line, and Everett Holloway, 78 years old now, moving with a cane he's finally stopped pretending he doesn't need, came in through the office door in a coat that was, Walter noted with some private amusement, considerably nicer than the original canvas one, but still, deliberately, plain, unremarkable. The coat of a man who has decided he prefers not to be noticed, even when there's no longer any practical reason to hide. He sat in the good chair by the stove, the same chair repaired twice over the years but never replaced, and Gus brought him coffee without being asked, and Sam's daughter, Dell, 3 years old now and utterly fearless around the machinery in a way that gives Nadine constant low-grade anxiety, climbed straight into his lap the moment she spotted him, entirely unbothered by the fact that the man holding her owned, among a great many other things, the very mill that employed nearly 200 of her neighbors' parents. Everett held her easily, the practiced ease of a man who has done this now for several Decembers running, and asked her with the same genuine, unhurried interest he once asked Walter about torque specs and Nadine about her classroom, what she'd learned that week, and Dell told him, with the complete confidence of a 3-year-old, an extended and largely inaccurate account of how dinosaurs and dump trucks were related, which Everett received with the same grave seriousness he'd have given a quarterly earnings report, nodding along and asking thoughtful follow-up questions until Sam finally rescued him, laughing 20 minutes later. Walter watched all of it from across the garage, wiping his hands on the same kind of shop rag he's used his entire working life, and told me that in that moment, watching a nearly 80-year-old billionaire hold his granddaughter and discuss dinosaur dump trucks with total sincerity, he understood something about the whole 9-year arc of this story that he hadn't quite been able to put into words before. It was never really about the money, obviously. Everyone involved in telling this story eventually says that, and it's true, but Walter says the deeper truth underneath even that observation is that the money was never even the interesting part to begin with. The interesting part, the part worth actually telling, is that a man can spend 4 decades building something as large as Holloway County Holdings, can amass more wealth than most people can meaningfully picture, and can still, underneath all of it, simply be hungry for the same small, plain things everyone else is hungry for: a warm place to sit, an honest conversation, a granddaughter's nonsense theory about dinosaurs, a mechanic who never once asked what was in it for him before deciding to help. Everett Holloway had all the money in the world for the better part of 2 decades before he ever met Walter Brennan, and none of it, by his own repeated account, had ever once made him feel as rich as 40 minutes by that particular wood stove, in that particular chair, with people who genuinely did not care what he was worth on paper. That, more than the mill, more than the fund, more than any of the numbers that eventually got attached to this story once lawyers and reporters got involved, is the actual lesson Walter Brennan wants people to take from it, if they take anything at all. He never set out to be tested. He never set out to be rewarded. He simply saw a man in a bad coat patting his empty pockets on a snowy Tuesday 9 winters before any of the rest of it happened, and he made the only choice that ever felt like a real choice to him, which was to help, plainly without calculation, the same way his own father had taught him to help everyone who ever walked through those 2 bay doors on Route 4. Everything else, the fortune, the mill, the reconciled family, the granddaughter now growing up half in a garage and half in the shadow of an empire she doesn't yet understand she'll someday be connected to. All of that was simply what happened to grow, unplanned and unasked for, out of 9 years of a decision that never once felt, to the man making it, like anything more complicated than common decency. I think, too, about how differently this whole story could have gone. And I don't just mean the obvious version, the one where Walter turns Everett away that first snowy Tuesday, and none of the rest of it ever happens. I mean the smaller forks in the road that came later, any one of which could have curdled this into something considerably less redemptive. If Walter had accepted Everett's first larger offer without pushing back, the story might have become, in Russell's telling and in the newspaper's telling, exactly the cautionary tale it was briefly, dangerously close to becoming. If Diane had never made that first phone call, never sat crying by that wood stove, the petition might have gone to a full hearing, and even a Walter Brennan who did absolutely nothing wrong could have found his family's name dragged through months of expensive, humiliating litigation regardless of the eventual outcome. If Gus hadn't stood up to that television van, if Curtis Ames hadn't written that long, unpolished comment defending a friend, if Ruth Callahan hadn't spent a week fielding calls nobody asked her to field, the shop's reputation might have taken years instead of weeks to recover, if it recovered at all. Every good outcome in this story required, at some specific juncture, an ordinary person choosing to do the harder, kinder thing instead of the easier, more self-protective one. And I think that's worth sitting with for a moment, because it means this was never actually a story about one lucky mechanic and one generous billionaire. It was a story about an entire chain of people, most of them with no financial stake in any of it at all, deciding, one after another, that decency was worth extending even when it cost them something, even when it would have been easier not to. Walter still works the same 2, now 3, bays most mornings, still wipes his hands on the same kind of shop rag, still greets every stranded stranger who rattles into that gravel lot the exact same way he greeted Everett Holloway 9 winters before any of the rest of the world knew that name. He'll tell you, if you ask him, and people do ask him now, more than he'd like, given how the story eventually made its way into regional papers, and then, inevitably, further than that he doesn't consider himself any kind of example to follow, that he was just a man doing what his father taught him to do, in the one specific corner of the world he was given to do it in. But I think, having spent this much time with his story, that he's wrong about that particular point. In the same modest, deflecting way, he's wrong about most compliments aimed his direction. I think Walter Brennan is exactly the kind of example worth following, not because he got lucky, though he did, but because he made the same small, costly, correct choice roughly 40 times over 9 years before luck ever entered the picture at all. And he has said more than once that he'd have kept making that same choice for 40 more years if Everett's truck had simply kept needing fixing and nothing else about the story had ever changed. That, I think, is the whole of it. The entire lesson underneath 9 winters of a mechanic's quiet kindness and one grieving billionaire's quiet search for proof that the world still had some decency left in it that didn't come with an invoice attached. You do not get to know, standing in a cold garage on a gray Tuesday afternoon, which broken-down truck belongs to which kind of stranger. You only get to decide in that moment who you are going to be regardless of the answer. And Walter Brennan decided the same way, 40 times running, long before he had any reason to expect it would ever matter to anyone but the man whose truck he was fixing. I have spent a long time now trying to figure out how to describe Coldwater Ridge itself to somebody who's never been there, because I think it matters, in the end, almost as much as any single person in this story does. It is not a remarkable place by most ordinary measures. It has one traffic light at the intersection of Main Street and Route 4 that half the town still complains was unnecessary when it went in 15 years back. It has a congregational church with a leaning steeple nobody's fixed, a hardware store that nearly closed twice, an elementary school that nearly consolidated, a diner called the Ridge Line, where the coffee is, by local consensus, only fair, not great, and a low cinder-block garage on the edge of town that a man named Del Brennan built with his own hands back when the paper mill still ran 3 shifts a day. And yet this unremarkable place, this one traffic light, one leaning steeple, one struggling hardware store kind of town, is the specific place. Out of 3 finalists and untold hundreds of towns Everett Holloway could theoretically have chosen from, that produced the one person out of every stranger he tested across 4 separate towns over 9 years, who treated him like a man instead of a wallet without a single moment of hesitation or calculation. I think that says something important about the actual texture of small towns that gets lost in a lot of the broader conversation about places like this one, places that outsiders sometimes write off as declining or struggling or left behind. Coldwater Ridge was never actually poor in the way that matters most. It was only ever poor in the ways a spreadsheet can measure. And Everett Holloway, of all people, a man who has spent 4 decades mastering exactly that kind of spreadsheet, was the one who finally proved, in the most personal way imaginable, that the other kind of wealth, the kind Marion had, the kind Walter's father built into that garage 1 favor at a time, was the kind that actually determined which town got to keep its future. Nadine told me once, near the end of one of our longer conversations about all of this, that she thinks the reason this story resonates with people who hear it, beyond the obvious appeal of a mechanic's fortunes changing overnight, is that it offers a kind of quiet reassurance that most people are hungry for without quite knowing how to ask for it, which is the reassurance that decency, plain, unglamorous, often costly decency, still counts for something in a world that can feel plenty of days. Like it mostly rewards the opposite. She said, Walt never did anything flashy. He never made a grand gesture. He just kept showing up, winter after winter, and doing the quietly harder thing instead of the easier one, 40 separate times, long before anyone was watching, long before there was any reason to think anyone ever would be. And I think that's exactly the kind of story people need reminding of periodically, that the quiet, unwitnessed choices, the ones you make when you're absolutely certain nobody of consequence will ever know about them, Those are the ones that actually build a person's whole character. And sometimes, in the rarest and strangest circumstances, they end up building considerably more than that too. If you've made it this far into Walter and Everett's story, I hope it left you with even a fraction of the warmth it left in this town. And I hope the next time you find yourself deciding whether a small kindness toward a stranger is worth the cost, that you remember there is no way to know in advance what that stranger actually needs it for, or what it might someday come to mean, and that the not knowing was never really the point in the first place. The point was always just deciding, plainly, who you were going to be, regardless of the answer underneath the coat. I think often, too, about the version of this story that never gets told, the 200 or so strangers Everett tested across 4 towns over 9 years who did not respond the way Walter did, the cashiers and gas station attendants and shopkeepers who reacted with suspicion or indifference, or that scrambling, apologetic excitement Everett described feeling from almost everyone else once the truth eventually came out. I don't think those people were monsters, and I don't think Everett ever framed them that way either in any of his long conversations with Walter by that stove. Most of them, I suspect, were simply ordinary people having an ordinary day, worn down by their own version of a hard winter, unable or unwilling to extend a stranger the specific costly kind of grace that Walter extended without a second thought 40 separate times. I think it's worth saying plainly that most people, on most days, are simply doing the best they can with whatever they've got left over after their own worries are accounted for, and that the specific rare thing Walter Brennan did wasn't that he never had worries of his own eating into his capacity for kindness. He very much did that hard 6th winter with the frozen tow truck and the tight February budget being the clearest possible proof of that. The rare thing was that he kept choosing the harder generosity anyway, even in the years when it cost him something real, even when Nadine found the entry in the books and could have reasonably asked him to stop and didn't, even when a scared old man's dignity mattered more to him in the moment than his own family's tight margins. I don't say any of this to diminish the people who didn't pass Everett's test, scattered across those other towns. I say it because I think the honest, complete version of this story has to include the reminder that Walter's kindness was not effortless, was not free of cost, was not some simple accident of a naturally generous temperament that required no real sacrifice to maintain. It was a discipline, practiced deliberately, winter after winter, sometimes at real expense to his own family, and I think that's actually the more useful, more replicable lesson buried inside all of this, more useful than any story about a lucky mechanic stumbling into a billionaire's favor. Anyone can be kind when kindness costs nothing. The version of decency this story is actually about is the kind that persists, specifically when it does cost something. When the tip jar's nearly empty, when the tow truck's broken and the roof loan's behind, when there is no earthly reason to expect that this particular act of grace will ever be recognized, let alone repaid. That is the entire hard, quiet center of what happened at Brennan's Auto and Diesel over 9 winters. And I think it's worth remembering long after the specific details of trucks and mills and billion-dollar fortunes have faded from memory, because most of us will never meet a disguised billionaire in our own garage or diner or hardware store. But every single one of us gets, with some regularity, our own small, unwitnessed chance to make the same choice Walter made in whatever modest currency our own life happens to deal in. And I think that chance is worth taking seriously every single time it comes around, precisely because we never get to know, in advance, what it's actually worth. Kayla Doiron, the young mechanic Walter hired a couple of years into all of this, has told him more than once that the story is part of why she wanted to work at Brennan's specifically, having heard a version of it secondhand from a former instructor at her trade school before she ever set foot in Coldwater Ridge. And she says what struck her most, hearing it, was not the billionaire twist at all, but the detail of Walter refusing Everett's first, larger offer, twice, simply because it was more than his family actually needed. She told Walter on her first week at the shop that she'd worked at 2 other garages before this one, where the owners would have taken every dollar offered without a second thought, and that the fact Walter hadn't taken it, even under real pressure during a hard month, told her everything she needed to know about whether she wanted to spend her career learning under him rather than under somebody who simply talked a good game about honesty without ever once being tested on it the way Walter plainly had been. Walter, characteristically, waved the compliment off and put her to work on a timing belt, but Gus told me privately that he thought it was one of the truest things anyone had said about his old friend in the entire 5 years since the story broke. So that's the story of Walter Brennan and Everett Holloway, and a blue Ford truck that ran 9 winters longer than it had any right to, held together by rust patches and duct tape, and one mechanic's stubborn refusal to let an old man in a worn coat feel small over a bill he couldn't pay. It's the story of a garage on Route 4 that nearly went under twice, once to a bad economy and once to a headline that got the truth backward, and survived both times because the people around it, family and neighbors and near strangers alike, kept choosing to show up for it. It's the story of 2 grown children who almost lost their father to a courtroom fight before a mechanic's plain honesty and a sister's harder phone call brought them back to him instead. And underneath all of it, it's the story of a very simple idea that Del Brennan taught his son with a torque wrench in his hand decades before any of this happened, that a shop or a town or a life is only ever as strong as its willingness to help the people who can't yet prove they're worth helping. If this story moved you even a little, if you found yourself hoping, somewhere around that first snowy Tuesday, that the man in the bad coat would turn out to be exactly what Walter needed him to be, I'd ask you to remember Walter's own words on the matter, that none of it would have meant anything if he'd known the ending in advance. Kindness only means what it means when it's offered, without knowing what's underneath the coat, and I hope, whatever your own version of Booth 6 or Bay 1 turns out to be, you get the chance to offer it anyway. I hope, too, that somewhere in your own life there is a version of that wood stove waiting for you, a chair, a thermos, an unhurried afternoon with somebody who asks after your family and remembers the answer months later, because I think that is, in the end, the real treasure. This whole story was always circling around, long before anyone knew there was a fortune involved at all. Everett Holloway had every material comfort a person could want for the better part of 2 decades, and he told Walter, more than once, that none of it ever came close to replacing 40 unhurried minutes a year by a stove that didn't care what he was worth. I think that's worth remembering the next time you find yourself rushing past a small kindness because you've decided you don't have the time or the margin for it. You may never find out what was underneath the coat, but the decency itself, offered plainly and without an angle, was never actually about what was underneath it in the first place. And if you enjoyed spending this time in Coldwater Ridge with Walter and Everett and the whole Brennan family, I hope you'll subscribe for more true stories like this one, because we tell a brand new one every single day, and there is always another quiet act of decency out there waiting to be discovered, growing, unnoticed, into something considerably larger than anyone standing in that cold garage on that first gray Tuesday ever could have expected. Thank you for staying with Walter and Nadine and Sam and Gus and Everett and the whole slow, unlikely turn of Coldwater Ridge's fortunes, all the way to the end. Stories like this one remind us that the biggest changes in our lives rarely announce themselves in advance. They arrive quietly, in a gravel lot, in a worn coat, in a decision made in the time it takes to exhale, long before anyone involved has any idea how far that decision is going to travel. If it's true stories like this one you're after, warm ones, honest ones, the kind that leave you looking a little differently at the next stranger who crosses your path needing something small, subscribe, and we'll see you tomorrow with another one.